On December 31st, 1992, Sam Wheaton's father beat his mother to death with a broken whiskey bottle. His parents hadn't been arguing. There hadn't been any tension between them or some inciting incident that set his father off. 1 minute, the man was pouring himself his nightly 2 fingers of whiskey, and the next, he was swinging the bottle as hard as he could. Sam would later say that he'd never forget the sound that the bottle made as it collided with his mother's left temple. It was a dull thunk, followed by a brief echo. He had never heard that exact sound before, and he hasn't since. That noise was followed by the crunch of bone as his mother's skull broke inward. Next came the escaping hiss of air as she gasped. Finally, there was the thud of her already lifeless body striking the kitchen floorboards. It was a momentary symphony of death. When the instruments fell silent, Sam no longer had a mother. At the same moment that everything was crashing down around him, another murder was taking place 3 doors down the block. Jeremy Thomas's mother was using one of her disposable razors to slit the throats of both him and his older sister. Despite him living so close, Sam didn't know Jeremy all that well. Jeremy was a year ahead of him in school. They had played Little League baseball together when they were younger, but they didn't have much in common, so they didn't spend time together except during those games. Across the street, Jenny Sanderson's mother didn't murder anyone. Instead, she used the freezer door of the refrigerator to bash her own brains in while her daughter watched in horror. The entire time she was doing so, she screamed loudly in French. Jenny had been unaware that her mother spoke that particular language. That night at exactly 8:17 p.m., a portion of the population in roughly a 2-block radius of Porters Grove, Indiana, simultaneously went horribly and violently insane. By 8:25 p.m. that same night, it was over. Sometime around 8:20 p.m., Sam Wheaton's father finished clubbing his mother with the blood-splattered whiskey bottle and turned his attention to him. Sam's father was an older man. He had married late in life to a woman over 15 years his junior. He never came right out and said it to his son, but Sam always had the feeling that his father hadn't expected to ever get married. That was until he met Sam's mother. Despite the age difference, it was like they had been born for each other. He had fallen head over heels in love with her and proposed to her less than a year after they met. Because he was older, Sam's father wasn't physically able to do many of the things with him that other fathers could do with their sons. The spirit was more than willing, and in fact wished very much to, but the body wasn't able. The arthritis he suffered from made it difficult for him to do something as simple as play catch. Sam never blamed him for his inability to run around and play. Even from a young age, Sam understood that it wasn't his father's fault. In a way, he even came to appreciate the man's age. What his father lacked in athletic ability, he more than made up for with stories from his life experiences and his fondness for classic adventure stories. He passed that love along to Sam. The man's age ended up being what saved Sam that night. When his father turned towards Sam, his right hand clutched around the neck of the bottle, Sam knew that it wasn't his father. Not really, not in any way that mattered. The sharp intelligence and gentle spirit were gone from his eyes. Whoever or whatever was looking at him was just some husk whose soul had been hollowed out and replaced with madness. Sam's father took one step forward before the bottle slipped from his grip. Sam watched it fall downward in slow motion before it struck the wooden flooring. He heard the glass crack, and dark brown liquid poured out from underneath the cap, but it still didn't break. His father's hand curled into a claw, and its fingers scraped at the empty air. His other hand moved to his chest. His breath caught in his throat, and within seconds of his body hitting the floor next to his wife, the heart attack had taken his life. The only reason Sam's father didn't murder him was because the man's heart gave out before he could do the deed. It's been nearly 25 years, and Sam still thinks about that almost every day. How could he not? How does someone possibly move on from a moment like that? Sam has tried therapy. He's tried medication. He's tried burying it under enough liquor to drown a fish. If there's a cure for what ails him out there, He hasn't found it yet. I've spoken with some of the other survivors of that night. They haven't found that elusive cure either. 8 minutes. That's all it took for dozens of lives to be changed forever. 8 minutes. My name is Catherine Jerome, and you're listening to Dead and Buried Crimes. The Porter's Grove massacre has been a subject of debate from the moment that it happened. There are countless questions that have never been fully answered. What did happen? How did it happen? What was the inciting incident? There had to be one, right? Dozens of people don't just randomly go crazy at the exact same time. The official statements provided by the authorities don't provide many insights. There don't seem to be any facts, just a series of assumptions and hypotheses. The general consensus from the various agencies is that the terrible night was the result of a particularly violent case of mass hysteria. That explanation doesn't feel very satisfactory, does it? It's no wonder that many people had stated publicly that they believed the government was trying to hide something. It's the belief of many that the officials knew more than they were saying. A simple shrug and a statement that amounts to, "we don't know," can't be the entire story. As I dug deeper into what happened that night in Porter's Grove, I got into contact with a number of people that had issued these official reports. I had expected there to be resistance to my inquiries, or at least that I'd have some difficulty getting people to speak with me. To my surprise, almost everyone that I spoke with seemed eager to assist in any way that they could. I went into the interviews prepared for almost anything. I wasn't prepared to come out of them convinced that no one that I talked to was lying. While I appreciate the honesty, it also meant that these interviews were something of a dead end. The people that had worked on the official reports had presented everything that they knew in those reports. The story would have ended there if not for pure dumb luck. While doing research for a different episode, I found myself in communication with a local historian in the town of Hampton, Nebraska. While he wasn't able to provide much information on the topic I contacted him about, he did send over a series of documents detailing other strange events in the town's history. One of those events took place on July 8, 1974. During a screening of The Man with the Golden Gun, a number of unrelated individuals attacked the other people that were there to see the movie. The movie had been playing for roughly an hour when 8 people began violently assaulting the other moviegoers around them. 4 people were killed and nearly a dozen others were injured. Based on the point of the movie where the attacks began and when they ended, it was determined that the entire incident lasted a total of 8 minutes. These reports had something that the Porter's Grove ones did not. Comments from the attackers themselves. Each of them stated that they remembered everything leading up to the incident and everything after, but the 8 minutes where they were brutally attacking everyone that they could get their hands on was a complete blank. Now that I knew that the length of the time the event took was a shared detail, I was able to focus my research and find another event that fit the pattern. This event occurred on February 16, 2004. It took place in a more isolated area, but in a way that made it even more terrifying. This event occurred on February 16, 2004. It took place in a more isolated area, but in a way that made it even more terrifying. Dennis and Brianna Ingalls were newlyweds, having been married just days earlier. While many couples would have spent their honeymoon on a tropical island or taken a cruise, they had always been more outdoorsy and instead decided to rent a cabin at Yellowstone National Park. It provided them with everything they wanted: access to hiking, new places to explore, and, of course, privacy. Their second evening there, Brianna went to bed earlier than usual. They had been hiking through the park all day, and the exhausting exercise had given her a migraine. Dennis read a few more chapters of the book he had started their first day at Yellowstone before joining her. At just after 2 a.m, Dennis awoke to find Brianna was no longer in bed next to him. He assumed that she had gone to the bathroom, and he rolled over to go back to sleep. He immediately returned to full consciousness as Brianna brought the fire poker down as hard as she could on his right ankle. Brianna wasn't a large woman. She stood barely over 5 feet tall, and she weighed under 120 pounds. Because of this, the blow didn't do as much damage as it could have. It was still enough to crack bone, however, and it split the skin just above the foot. More out of instinct than anything else, Dennis rolled off the far side of the bed before the second swing struck him. Instead, it landed on the bed with a muffled thump. With foam coming out of her mouth and rage written into every inch of her face, Brianna quickly followed him around the bed and attempted to bludgeon him again. Dennis managed to get upright enough to wrestle the poker away from his wife. Now disarmed, she immediately reached out with her hands to attempt to wrap her fingers around his throat. Because of their size difference, Dennis was able to fight her off and pin her down to the floor. Without hesitation, she sank her teeth deep into his shoulder. No matter how hard he tried to pull away, she kept biting down. Pushing as hard as he could, he finally forced her to release her grip. Skin tore away and blood poured out of the wound. Not sure what else to do, Dennis pulled the mattress down on top of Brianna and covered her with it, keeping her pinned to the floor as he pleaded with her to come to her senses. He was careful not to push hard enough to suffocate her, but this compassion made it much more difficult. Eventually, mercifully, she stopped her thrashing and called out her husband's name. When he removed the mattress, Brianna was staring up at him in fear and confusion. She had no memory of attacking her husband. From start to finish, her temporary insanity had lasted just 8 minutes, but to Dennis, it had seemed to go on forever. He drove them both to the closest medical facility. While his wounds were treated, Brianna went through a battery of psychological tests to try to determine what had caused her to snap. When she passed those tests and no signs of mental illness were detected, the determination was made that it hadn't been a case of temporary insanity after all. Instead, she was told that she had been going through a rare form of sleepwalking and hadn't been in control of her actions. If this was an isolated case, sleepwalking might sound like a perfectly acceptable diagnosis. Brianna Engel's doctors were only able to work with the information that they had. Eventually, she was released, and there have been no further incidents. I was surprised to learn that she is still married to Dennis. I can only imagine how much of a strain such an event is on a marriage. Normally, when I put together these podcasts, I try to keep myself out of the narrative as much as possible. I'll drop in a personal opinion from time to time, yes, but I make it clear when that is happening. I'd much rather be the vessel for the story rather than be part of it. In this case, though, through no desire of my own, I find myself having been brought into the story. I'm not sure how someone found out that I was looking into these particular events. It wasn't that I was trying to keep my interest a secret or anything along those lines. When I contacted the involved parties, I used my real name and was honest about wanting more information so that I could present it to my listeners. One of the people that I contacted either passed my interest along to another party, or that party learned of my inquiries some other way. My contacts have all told me that they didn't speak with anyone else about the matter, and I have no reason to not believe them. Still, it's possible one or more of them are lying to me. I don't think that's the case, but it's a possibility. The other possibility, the one that I believe to be both more likely and more frightening, is that my research raised some red flags and led to me being monitored by someone. I don't know this person's identity, but simply to have something to refer to that person as, I've taken to calling them X. Not a very creative moniker, I admit, but appropriate given my lack of information about the person. 2 days after speaking with Dennis Ingalls, I received my first email from X. All of my communication with the people involved in the 8-minute events had been done through the podcast's email account. X's email, however, came to my private account, one that I only give to friends and family. Thinking back on it, I'm convinced that this was a flex, a way to impress on me that X knew more about me than they should. The email was titled 8 minutes, and there wasn't anything written in the body itself. Even the from field was blank, which I didn't know was possible. There were only a pair of attachments. The first attachment was a simple list of 12 items. Each of those items consisted of a date, a time window of 8 minutes, and a location. All 3 of the events that I had discovered independently were on the list. I stared at the list for a long time, trying to wrap my mind around the implications. 12 events over a 50-year period, with the most recent of them coming in May of this year, all of them happening on American soil. It seemed impossible. How could that possibly be the case? Surely the existence of these events would be common knowledge if there had been that many. The second attachment was a series of spreadsheets that were heavily redacted. Each sheet was labeled with the name of one of the towns on the list of events. It was difficult to tell because of the redacting, but they appeared to be a listing of assignments for some unnamed agency. I had barely finished reading through the spreadsheets when my cell phone rang. When I checked it, I saw that the call was from an unknown caller. I'm not ashamed to say that I was feeling pretty freaked out at this point. I seriously considered ignoring the call deleting the email. There was obviously something going on that went well beyond what I was comfortable with. My curiosity won out over my apprehension, however. Taking a deep breath, I answered my phone. The voice on the other end of the call was so distorted that it could have been either male or female. It instructed me to remain silent and that it would not answer any questions. Before I could even think about responding, it continued. On July 16, 1945, the United States performed the first nuclear weapon test a little over 200 miles outside of Los Alamos, New Mexico. The testing of this plutonium implosion device was codenamed Trinity, and the officials responsible for the test were more than satisfied by the results. The detonation was so powerful that it turned the sand and asphalt into green glass. As this was the first test of its kind, there was no way to know what other effects the detonation would have. The radiation levels were higher than expected, for example, and the explosion area was larger than the prediction. 8 days after the detonation, in a small town called Christensen, New Mexico, the first 8-minute event occurred. 6 people attending a church baseball game went into psychotic rage and began to attack both the other players and the people watching the game. It resulted in 4 deaths and at least a dozen people hospitalized. Due to the closeness of the event to the bomb test, both in time and proximity, the government responded by sending in representatives from a number of different agencies to investigate any possible connection. This was done without the knowledge of the residents of Christensen. The government agents were able to determine that the event and the bomb test were indeed related to one another. X didn't give me any details, but he told me that the detonation of a nuclear device had inadvertently caused a temporary change in the area's electromagnetic field. In a small section of that area where the change happened to be exactly what it needed to be, it would cause a catastrophic interaction with certain individuals whose brains' electrical impulses happened to be firing in exactly the right way. In other words, some people's brains would short circuit for a small amount of time, causing uncontrollable rage and bloodlust to take over. After further investigation, the government agents found that it would take the human brain 8 minutes to reset. A flood of questions came to mind, and without thinking, I attempted to ask one when X paused to take a breath. Instead of allowing me to proceed or reminding me that I was told I wouldn't be able to ask questions, they instead continued on as if they didn't even hear me. Although the result hadn't been expected, the government welcomed it. Officials immediately saw the potential in it. If they could find a way to replicate the change in the electromagnetic field and control where the change happened, it could be a potent weapon. Plant a device inside of an enemy town or base, turn it on, and let the people inside tear themselves apart. Of course, that was easier said than done. Duplicating a side effect of a nuclear detonation wasn't a simple process, especially considering the very first of those detonations had just happened. It would be a long and difficult process, and even if it was indeed possible to recreate the results, those results would also need to be improved upon. The government officials didn't want just some of the people in the targeted area affected. They wanted them all to be. That was the beginning of an ongoing series of experiments performed by the United States government on its own population. 12 experiments, to be precise, performed between 1945 and 2023. According to X, a different device was used during each experiment, with each iteration improving on the last. The experiments are still ongoing, meaning that there are more planned for the future. With that, X ended the call. That call took place 2 weeks ago. Right up until the moment that I pressed the record button, I debated whether or not to release this episode into the wild. I don't know if I can trust X or if it's just someone screwing around with me, but if what they say is true, this is way above my pay grade. Ultimately, I decided that it was best to put everything that I had together and present it to you listeners to come to your own decisions. If everything X has told me is a hoax, it still adds an interesting twist to the 3 8-minute events that I was able to verify before they contacted me. I've tried to verify the other 9 events on X's list, but haven't been able to one way or another. If what X is telling me is true, though, that's an entirely different thing. It would mean that our own government is using us as guinea pigs in a horrible experiment designed specifically to drive people into a state of violent insanity. It would explain why I haven't been able to prove or disprove the other events on X's list. The government would be only testing in places where it knows that it can tightly control the narrative. I wish that I had more answers for you listeners. Maybe someday I will. What I've laid out for you today is all the information that I have at this moment, though. If someone out there knows more, please get in touch with me. This is one of those stories that I don't think I'll be able to let go. Thank you for listening to the Dead and Buried Crimes podcast. I'm Catherine Jerome, and as always, stay safe out there.
Okay, so there's a story about an incident that happened at Disney back in the 1950s. Yeah, I know. I'm not here to tell you ancient stories from the golden age of animation. I get that. Believe me, I get that. I know exactly why I'm sitting in this chair with you three gentlemen looming over me. Just indulge me for a moment. I promise there's a point to this. So back in the 50s, Disney wasn't the entertainment juggernaut they are today. At that point, they were almost exclusively concerned with churning out cartoons. Most people today are under the impression that all the company's films were successful, but the truth of the matter is that Disney was in a lot of trouble back then. A number of their films had failed financially, even some of the ones that are seen today as classics, and it was really the television and newspaper cartoons that were keeping the lights on. Small film strips, too, the kind that used to play before the feature presentations. A couple of cartoonists were working on a short when they realized that they needed a particular sound effect to really make a scene work. It wasn't one they'd used before, so they didn't have it on file. And after going through the sound archives, they couldn't find anything that was quite right. Um, Somehow, one of them realized that they could get what they wanted by slowing down the noise of a soldering iron. They tinkered around with it for a while, and at one point, they put it down all the way to 12 hertz. See, they didn't understand what sound can do if you're not careful. The cartoonists were sick for days after they created the effect. Rumor has it that Walt Disney happened to be there with them at the time and that he fell ill as well. Having a 12 hertz sound run through your body is roughly the equivalent of sitting in an office chair and letting your coworker spin you around for a few hours, then trying to stand up and walk around. When the body is exposed to sound, just like when it's exposed to pretty much anything else, there's always a reaction. This is especially true with low frequencies. We call that infrasounds. Our ears can't hear them, but they can do a number on us. Did you know that the noise around 19 hertz can cause people to hallucinate? That's because it's the resonant frequency for the human eye. The vibrations can cause us to see all kinds of crazy things. The real dangerous one, though, that's 7 hertz. It's the resonant frequency for your brain and your other internal organs. You crank that one up if you really want to get the party started. Everything from nausea, disorientation, you start to get paranoid like everyone in the world is watching you. You let it go on long enough, and your organs actually physically start to tear themselves apart. Any longer than that, and that's it. The end. You're done. The reason I'm telling you all this is because you need to understand that the science behind what Dr. Varadkar attempted was sound. No pun intended. As much as it sounds like something that came out of a bad pulp science fiction novel, it's actually based on 100 years of scientific research. That's how he got the government to agree to the funding. I wasn't a part of that pitch meeting, so I can only imagine that those suits were sitting there licking their chops at what he was presenting them. And it makes sense, too, right? If sound can be used to affect the human body, it should be possible to use sound to make changes to it as well. With the right frequency, volume, and other conditions, it would be theoretically possible to make a person far more susceptible to suggestion. Taking it a step further, it would even be possible to basically rewrite how that person thinks. The human body is, for all intents and purposes, a biological machine, and sound can be used to hack that machine. Now, you know what happened next. The committee approved Dr. Varadkar's grant. How could they not? He was telling that he was going to give them a way to directly influence each and every member of the population on a silver platter. Even if they weren't going to use that technology in American citizens, and let's just be honest with ourselves and acknowledge that someone eventually would have tried to do just that, it would have made one hell of a weapon. Win a war without firing a single shot by making your enemies see things your way, whether they want to or not. The committee went one step further, though. Varadkar needed test subjects, lots of them, and they needed to be highly varied. Different backgrounds, different biological makeups, different diets, all of that. Being able to adjust the thought process of a single person wouldn't cut it. He needed to make sure that he found universal sounds and frequencies so that anyone and everyone would be affected. Because of this, the committee agreed to allow Varadkar to use an entire town as his own personal playground. And I gotta tell you, even with everything that's happened, That's the part I still cannot get my head wrapped around. The United States government turned over an entire town of its own citizens to a single person so that he could poke and prod and experiment on it. I guess that pretty much sums up what our own elected officials really think about us, doesn't it? The town that Vodkar chose is Williams, Arizona. It was the perfect place for his experiments, really. It had a varied enough population that it presented a wide range of test subjects, but it was also isolated from the main highways, and it had very little in the way of outsiders passing through. It was 3,108 brains to pump dangerous sounds into. 3,108 men, women, and children that didn't have a choice. Vrodkar told me that he was working on a new warning system that could transmit a signal throughout a large area by using particular tones on specific frequencies. That's not anything that's needed here in the States, but it would be invaluable in places where groups of people live that don't have the luxury of readily available cell phone service. People could be warned about imminent floods in even the most remote parts of the Middle East, for example. A specific sound would be transmitted over a much larger distance than, say, the sirens we use now to warn people about tornadoes. It would completely eliminate issues like language barriers. A person hears this particular sound, and they know that they need to get to somewhere safe. Rodkar said that what he was working on was a series of tones that could be used as a sort of universal system. One tone for flood, another one for sandstorm, a different one for tornado, so on and so forth. He told me that once he figured the system out, he was going to work with frequencies to increase distance and reception by the human body. I know it sounds crazy now, but I actually did believe that I was helping with some kind of humanitarian project. Part of the project was conceal the towers from view. I did find that part odd, but the way it was explained to me was that it was simply to not take away from the natural beauty around the town, and also not to call unneeded attention to the project. Yeah, I know, it was a bad reason, and I should have questioned it further, but it really wasn't that strange of a request. I've been contracted by countless people that want a system that works, but don't want to see it when it's doing so. It's not like I'm not accustomed to hiding some rich person's giant satellite dish or transmitting towers in a football stadium. Rodkar and we got along well enough during the building stage. Once the towers were finished, he asked me to stay on site in case any mechanical issues came up. I have a pretty busy schedule, and my services are in pretty high demand. So at first I turned him down. Then he turned around and showed me the figure he was willing to pay me for a few months extra work, and I decided I couldn't afford to turn that down. Now, this next part is what Vrodkar himself ended up telling me about what happened. I didn't find out about what he had really been up to until later, and as much as I like to say that I had a bad feeling or some sneaking suspicion that something was up, the truth is I didn't notice anything that made me question what I'd been told. So what I'm about to tell you is what he told me, not what I witnessed firsthand. So take that for what it's worth. Rodkar and his team started small. They already had a number of frequencies that would make a person feel anxious or disoriented, so they tried to see if they could simply tweak those to make the test subjects more open to suggestion. Nothing really happened for the first few weeks. That may sound like a long time to be working on such a small range of sounds, but you have to understand just how precise of frequencies they were working with. There's a lot of room between 8 and 9 hertz, for example. Vrodkar was testing frequencies out to over 50 decimal places. The majority of the time, the residents didn't even realize anything was happening. We can't hear anything below roughly 20 hertz, and he was working in ranges much lower than that. He was also just using short bursts in the beginning. It wasn't until he started to extend the broadcast times that things really began to go downhill. The number of people going to the local hospital rose dramatically. A lot of the people were complaining about feeling sick even though they didn't have the usual symptoms of a cold or the flu. There were several cases involving coughing up blood or bleeding from various orifices. A few elderly patients suffered heart attacks. Vrodkar was aware of all this. Somehow he was getting all of the medical records that were processed at the hospital. Either someone was getting the information to him, or he was obtaining it himself. I'm not sure which it is. Like I said, this is just what I pieced together from what he told me and from things I saw later. I didn't see Varadkar much during that time period. Since the towers were working without issues, there wasn't much for me to do, so I spent the majority of my time in the trailer that I've been provided with. Like the other trailers and the few buildings that had been constructed, it was heavily soundproofed. I and all of the other staff on site would be sent a text message when a test was about to occur, and we'd go into our designated areas to wait for it to be over. I don't know what test number it was when things started to get out of hand. If I had to take a guess, I'd say it probably wasn't a single test, but more a cumulative effect from multiple ones being done. Uh, all I know for sure is that dozens of assaults were reported to the local police within a 3-hour window. We were located quite a few miles outside of the city limits, but I could still hear gunshots when I stood outside of my trailer. I was listening to that distinctive popping sound when one of the guards came into camp with the news that a fire was burning on the east side of the town. Rodker and his team came rushing out of the temporary metal building they used as their base camp. I've never seen anyone move as quickly as they were. He barked a few orders to his team, and they piled into a group of minivans and left immediately. Once they were gone, he yelled at the guards to begin breaking down the camp. He then came rushing over to me and grabbed me by the shirt, demanding that I tell him how to turn off the towers. I was completely baffled by his shouting. I knew for a fact that he was aware how to shut them down. He had been doing just that at the end of each test. I tried to explain that to him, but he kept saying that they were still on and that I needed to turn them off. His eyes were wild, and there was this spittle or foam at the corners of his mouth. He was usually the most calm and collected man I had ever known, but at that moment, he looked like a maniac, an absolute lunatic. He brought me into the metal building and once again instructed me to shut off the broadcast towers. As calmly as I could, I told him that it was all done through the main power switch, which was on the main computer board underneath a series of a dozen monitors. He sneered at me and pointed at the monitors, telling me that they couldn't possibly be off if this was what was still happening in Williams. I didn't know what he was talking about, so I went over to the monitors to take a look. I immediately regretted that decision, and I have every minute since. The images on those monitors, they showed what I imagine hell to look like. Citizens of the town were tearing themselves and each other apart. The atrocities on those monitors being committed, it it wasn't a riot. I know that's the popular story, but I'm here to tell you that it most definitely wasn't a riot. As strange as this is going to sound, it wasn't organized enough to be one. It was like everyone had suddenly decided that it was every man for himself. I watched as an older man of maybe 60 just brutally clubbed in the skull of a teenage boy with, I think it was a tire iron. I actually knew that man. I had gone to town several times to get food or just to stretch my legs when testing wasn't happening. So I recognized him as the owner of a local deli. He was a nice man. I couldn't tell who the boy was. He just, there wasn't enough of him left to even call him a person anymore, let alone make an identification. On another monitor, two women were slowly driving around the parking lot of a gas station in an old beat-up station wagon. A rope was tied around the back bumper, and at the end of the rope was a man with his neck tied in a noose. He was screaming as he was dragged across the pavement, leaving these smears of blood and a trail behind him. There were countless examples of depravity on those displays, but there's one that I cannot get it out of my head no matter how hard I try. There was a woman standing directly in front of one of the cameras. I'm sure the camera was hidden, but just by some stroke of luck, she had managed to get into the very center of the frame. She was just standing there in jeans and a hooded sweatshirt, and she was reaching up and slowly peeling chunks of skin off of her face with this almost bored expression. I tore my eyes away from the monitor as Varadkar once again demanded that I shut off the towers. My stomach was churning as I looked down at the computer board on the desk. I thought I was going to throw up right then and there, but somehow I managed to keep myself together. The light at the indicating when the towers were transmitting, it was off. I checked the logs and verified that there wasn't even any power running to the towers. They weren't sending out a signal, and they hadn't been for several hours. When I showed all that to Varadkar, he sat down in one of the leather chairs and buried his face in his hands. He looked exhausted, and he seemed older. I was close to panic at this point. I knew that what was happening in Williams had to be at least partially my fault, and I yelled at him to tell me just what the fuck was going on. All he did was he pointed at a clipboard sitting on one of the tables. I picked it up and I started to read through the documents. As I was doing that, Varadkar very slowly, very haltingly told me what I told you earlier. The real intentions of the project, the committee meeting, and how the government had handed over an entire town to him. He didn't sound remorseful. If anything, it was more like he was trying to convince me that he had done the right thing and this was just some sort of acceptable outcome. The papers were a listing of test numbers along with the results of those tests. There weren't any exact frequencies listed, but there were reference numbers that I assumed could be used to find that out. The most recent test, the one that happened a few hours prior, it was detailed at the top of the sheet. At first, the team had thought that it was another failed test. Nothing had happened immediately, and the people that they were observing didn't seem to be affected by it in any way. About an hour after the test, though, a man was observed hitting another man without any provocation. More of these incidents happened as time passed until suddenly the entire town had just erupted in violence. Instead of things growing calmer the further out they got from the test, they had instead inexplicably began to ramp up. There was this handwritten note at the bottom of the page that I had to read several times to make sure that I was understanding it correctly. One of the scientists had found out that the test frequency was still resonating in the brains of the subjects they had monitors installed in. I have no idea how they got monitors into people's brains. I mean, there's no way that the people knew about that, right? They never would have volunteered for that, and Varadkar's group wouldn't have told them what it was for anyway, so they would have been blindly accepting something. I can't imagine that's the case. Regardless of how they did it, the scientists noted that the resonance was actually growing stronger as time passed rather than fading. You have to understand, that simply should not have been possible. That's not how it works. If you take away the source, there's nothing to continue to cause the resonance to happen. There could be effects from the resonance, yeah, but it wouldn't just continue on. And for it to keep growing stronger, I don't have any explanation for it. There was more to it, though. The vibration was actually passing on from person to person. When an affected person was close enough to an unaffected one for a long enough period of time, the brain of the unaffected one would begin to display a synchronous vibration. It was the equivalent of striking a tuning fork, putting next to a second one, and the second one just starting to vibrate at the same frequency. To put it in even simpler terms, this madness was contagious. I put down the clipboard and I just stared at Varadkar for a long time. I don't know how long it was. I couldn't think of a single thing to say. I mean, how do you put the feelings you experience from reading something like that into words? Vodkar was the one who actually ended up speaking first. He raised his head out of his hands and looked directly at me. The expression on his face was, if I had to describe it, I'd say it was the expression of someone that had completely given up. "The devil's tone," he said, in a matter-of-fact voice that sent a chill down my spine. Before I knew what was happening, he reached under his lab coat and he pulled a gun out from his belt. I hadn't noticed it before with everything else that was happening. He turned it on me, pointed directly at me, and I stood completely still. I was afraid that even the smallest movement might set him off. But then, without even blinking, he turned the gun, put it right into his mouth, and pulled the trigger. It went off with this loud roar, and his body slumped forward in the chair as pieces of skin and blood and bone splattered onto the wall behind him. And that's when the guards came into the building. You obviously know the rest. I had a hood put over my head, and the next time it came off was when I got here, wherever here is. Look, I don't know what you're going to do to me, and frankly, I really don't care. I didn't know what I was a part of, but it doesn't change the fact I was still part of it. But it doesn't matter now, though. The only thing that matters is that you figure out how to stop that resonance. There is no way that it's Justin Williams at this point. There were hours between the final test and that outbreak of violence. How many people left town during that time period without knowing what they were carrying inside of them? It's impossible to know. You have to figure out how to stop it before it keeps getting passed on and on and on until we are all completely and totally fucked. Do you understand me? You have to stop it now, and when you do, you need to toss everything Vodkar worked on into a fire and fucking burn it to ashes. Slam this door to hell closed and make sure it never opens again.
I wasn't very gentle with the door as I kicked it open. In fact, I struck it so hard with my foot that I felt a stab of pain in my toes. Swearing loudly, I entered the stairwell and stormed down the steps. My footsteps echoed off the close walls and metal steps as I descended. As I did so, I kept thinking that I shouldn't have come to this damn apartment building in the first place. I hadn't lived there in months. I had a place across town. The only reason I was there was at the bidding of my wife. No, not wife, I corrected myself. Ex-wife. Even though that was an extremely new development, there was a huge difference there. No more trial separation. What a fucking joke name for a fucking joke idea. You're having trouble with your marriage? Let's see if distance helps with solving all the problems the two of you have. Communication? Nah. Counseling? Nope. What you need is fucking distance. When she had called earlier that day, I had thought that maybe, just maybe, Courtney had realized the separation was nonsense. We'd been together since freshman year of high school. We knew each other better than anyone else. It wasn't distance that our admittedly struggling marriage needed. What we needed was closeness and an open dialogue and just being with one another. That's all. We could get past our issues and get things back on track if we were in the same damn room together. Apparently the hope of reconciliation was an empty one. I had barely stepped through the apartment door before she was shoving divorce papers in my face. She had already signed them, her name written out in that perfect penmanship that she had always had. The relationship of a lifetime burned away with nothing more than a few strokes of a pen. To say that I hadn't been happy about it would have been an understatement. In that exact moment, I think I hated her, and anger had flowed out of me. I had yelled and ranted and raved, not really knowing what I was saying, but letting her have every ounce of venom that I had festering inside of me. She had simply stood there and took it. The calm expression on her face made my rage grow even stronger. I don't know how long it was that I screamed at her. It was quite a while, though, and by the time that I was done, I was soaked in sweat. Courtney had weathered the storm of my accusations and insults, and she had done so without a single word. Once I had finished, she had led me into the kitchen, sat me down at the table, and waited for me to sign the papers. She was so matter-of-fact about it. It was like everything that we had been through up to that point simply didn't matter. All that she wanted was to be done with the marriage, done with me, and done with the conversation. Yeah, well, she had gotten what she wanted. We were done. All that was left of our relationship were the various items and mementos in the box I was now carrying. The apartment building wasn't large, just 2 stories tall from the top floor to the ground level. I was about halfway down the stairs when the lights overhead began to flicker. What the building lacked in height, it more than made up for in age. It was easily the oldest structure on the block, and there were always issues with the power. Most of those issues weren't serious, but they were still annoying. I glanced up at the lights before continuing on. I had only gone down a few more steps when the bulbs of the stairs behind me went out completely. Stopping, I turned slightly and looked back up towards the second floor. There were no windows in the stairwell, and without the lights, everything more than a couple of yards away from me was covered in total darkness. My anger diminished slightly as a small bit of discomfort replaced it. I know it's irrational and maybe even borderline stupid, but I've always been afraid of the dark. Not to the point where I can't sleep without a light on. I'm not a child. It's enough that I won't go into dark basements or walk down unlit alleys at night, though. Turning back around, I started descending the stairs again. My pace was just a little bit quicker than it had been previously. While I knew logically that there was no one in the stairwell with me, that lizard part of my brain didn't care what my fancy logic said and just wanted to be back out in the daylight. I felt a wave of relief go through me as I reached the ground floor. I hurried over to the door and tried to pull it open. It didn't budge. Frowning, I tried again with the same result. I didn't understand what was happening. The knob was turning, but the door wasn't opening. After a few more futile attempts, I knelt down and examined the door closely. The knob itself didn't have a lock, and there was enough light coming through the crack between the door and frame for me to see that there wasn't a deadbolt. There was no reason, at least not one that I could find, for it not to be cooperating. It had to be broken or jammed or something. Not sure what else to do, I knocked on it a few times. Those knocks started off quiet, almost timid, but they quickly became harder and more desperate as the seconds ticked by without an answer. My knuckles began to hurt. Giving up, I lowered my hand and rubbed it with the other. "Hello?" a voice called from the other side. Despite myself, I jumped in surprise. I'd been completely convinced that no one could hear my pounding. I waited for my heart rate to return to something resembling normal before I answered. "Yes, I'm here," I said, leaning closer to the door. "Can you hear me?" "I can hear you," came the reply after a moment's hesitation. Even without seeing the speaker, I could tell that the voice belonged to a young girl. I had been hoping to get the attention of someone older and more likely to be able to help, but beggars can't be choosers. I got down on one knee so that my own voice would be closer to her level. "The door is stuck," I told the girl as calmly as I could. "Can you go get an adult to help me? Maybe your mommy or your daddy?" "My daddy isn't here anymore," she answered. "Mama says that he went to go live with his other family because he doesn't care about us." I blinked, not sure where to even begin with that. "I'm sorry. Could you go get your mama then? I really need to get out of here." Another hesitation. "I can't do that." "What? Why not? It doesn't have to be your mama. It can be any grown-up that can help." "I'm really sorry." I shook my head in frustration. "Come on, kid. Just go get an adult." "Nuh-uh. We can't open the door. A monster is in there." Before I could even process what she had just told me, I heard rapid footsteps as she ran away from the door and farther down the hallway. I started banging on the door again, yelling for her to come back. That yelling turned into pissed-off screaming. Nothing seemed to work, and by the time I stopped, my throat was slightly sore. A monster. It's probably some bullshit her absentee mother told her to keep her out of the stairwell. What a fucking brat. I turned away from the door and looked up the stairs. If I couldn't get out this way, the only option was to go back up to the second floor and use the stairwell on the other side of the building. With a sigh, I started forward. As my foot pressed down on the first step, there was an audible pop as another of the overhead lights went out. I stopped moving and craned my neck upwards. The upper half of the stairwell was now dark. Only two lights, the ones closest to the ground level, were still lit. I stared into the darkness nervously, but I knew that I didn't have a choice. Taking a deep breath and swallowing hard, I started climbing the stairs back towards the upper level. Each step brought me closer to the gloom, and every time I took those steps, my heart beat in my chest just a little harder. There was something strange about the darkness. It wasn't until I drew closer that I was able to figure out what that something was. There was a clearly defined line where the light stopped and the black void began. Normally there would be a fading effect, a certain distance where light gradually diminished until it was swallowed up by the dark. That wasn't happening here. It was like the light from the bulbs couldn't break through it at all. I tried to shrug it off. My eyes were playing tricks on me and the fading really was there. Or maybe the way the ceiling had sloped had something to do with it. There was, of course, a rational explanation, even if I couldn't immediately recognize it. No matter how much I tried to rationalize things, though, I just couldn't convince myself that something else wasn't going on. My fear of the dark had kicked into full swing. As I peered up the stairs, I was sure that I could see figures even blacker than their surroundings moving inside of the darkness. Without realizing I was doing so, I came to a halt and gripped the railing tightly. I couldn't force myself to continue on. Shaking my head, I practically ran down the stairs to the ground floor. I didn't care if I was acting like a frightened child. All that I cared about was getting further into the light and away from the dark. I set down the box I was carrying next to the door and leaned up against the wall. My heart was thudding violently against my chest, and I was breathing heavily. If things continued that way, I was going to have a heart attack. It was difficult, but I managed to get myself calmed down enough that I no longer felt lightheaded and the spots of my vision disappeared. I almost let out a yelp when I heard a thump from the upper level. It was the sound of the second floor stairwell door opening. I had heard it countless times when I had lived in the building. Now that familiar noise was scaring me half to death. I curled my hands into fists as I silently cursed myself for being such a coward. I waited for the person that had come into the stairwell to come down, but that didn't happen. I strained my ears as much as I could while listening intently. There was nothing. Apparently no one had actually come to the door. Maybe they had bumped into it while passing by, or maybe they had taken one look at how dark it was inside and said fuck no to that. So quiet that I wasn't sure I actually heard it. Something in the darkness moved. The breath caught in my throat. I stood completely still, my eyes locked on the spot where the light and dark met. In my mind, that marked the spot where safety and danger were clearly defined. Whatever had made the sound was on the wrong side of that line. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as I listened for any other sign that something was really up there. While I didn't hear anything, I became more and more convinced as the seconds ticked by that there was a presence in the darkness. I know how that sounds, especially coming from someone that was self-admittedly afraid of the dark. I was absolutely sure that I was being watched, though. There was another noise. It was still quiet, but I was able to hear it better this time. It was the sound of a bare foot stepping down onto concrete. I had been right. There really was someone up there. Under normal circumstances, I would have called up to the person. These were hardly normal circumstances, however. Every instinct that I had was telling me that whatever was up on the second floor wasn't just a resident of the apartment building. I didn't say anything. I kept my mouth shut while also trying to keep myself under control. I didn't think that my heavy breathing could be heard that far up, but I didn't want to find out, either. I heard a third slap as the unknown presence went down another step. It was moving slowly and methodically towards me. Trying to be as quiet as possible, I attempted to pull the door open again. It remained stuck. When the person took yet another step, the next in the series of overhead lights flickered. A voice in the back of my head told me that I didn't know that whatever was coming down those stairs was actually a person. Unbidden images of monstrous abominations came into my mind. Any sort of nightmare could be hidden in the darkness. I forced those thoughts out of my head. I was only going to drive myself into a complete breakdown if I continued thinking that way. I had to keep my wits about me so that I could come up with some way out of this. And there had to be a way out. I couldn't accept that I was trapped inside and at the mercy of whatever was descending those stairs. I wouldn't let myself be a victim, not ever again. I once again surveilled my surroundings in hopes of finding something that I had missed. I noticed a large air vent on the wall to my left. I either hadn't seen it earlier, or I had subconsciously dismissed it. It was high up on the wall, but I hurried over to it anyway and reached up. The tips of my fingers touched the bottom of the metal grate. After stretching as hard as I could, I was able to grasp the frame, but it was secured firmly to the wall, and there was no way that I was going to be able to pry it off, let alone climb up into the vent itself. The flickering lights died completely as I heard another step in the darkness. This one was closer, around the halfway mark where there was a small landing before the stairs turned towards my direction. The gap between myself and the unseen presence had closed considerably while I had been distracted with the vent. I looked up. There was only one set of lights left. The illuminated section of the stairwell now barely reached the stairs. If the last bulbs went out, there wouldn't be anything left except the small amount of light coming from the red exit sign above the door. I backed up closer to the door. There really wasn't a way out. Even though I knew it was pointless, I grabbed the knob and pulled as hard as I could. After straining against it for a long moment, I placed one foot on the wall and yanked back so hard that my other foot came off the ground. For at least a minute, I put my full body weight into it, suspended above the ground as I prayed that my sweaty hands wouldn't slip off the knob. The muscles on my back and arms went from sore to feeling like they were on fire, and I was forced to stop. I banged on the door with my right hand. There wasn't much power behind it. I was exhausted from the exertion and fear. Not knowing what else to do, I turned towards the encroaching darkness as the lights started dimming. "Please," I begged, feeling tears starting to run down my cheeks. "Please just leave me alone." The last of the overhead lights went out. With terror completely taking over, I pressed myself up against the door. The only source of light now was the dim red glow of the exit sign, and although it wasn't even strong enough to illuminate my entire body, I clung to the hope that it would protect me like a child clings to a stuffed animal. My eyes were moving constantly back and forth as they tried in vain to see anything in the darkness. I was breathing in short, ragged gasps, and on the verge of a panic attack. Because of this, it took me a moment to smell the scent that had wafted into my nose. When I finally realized what it was, though, I recognized it immediately. It was the smell of the shampoo that my wife used. I wouldn't have thought it was possible, but I became even more afraid. It wasn't possible that she was here. There was no fucking way. My mind flashed back to the scene in Courtney's apartment earlier that afternoon. She had ambushed me with the divorce papers, and after my initial anger over that had started to die down, we had gone into the kitchen and I had signed the papers. She had gotten what she wanted. Even though I had signed the damn papers that I never wanted in the first place, she just had to open her mouth one last time. She had looked me in the eyes and told me with this look of pity on her face that this was for the best. That was when all the pain and disappointment and boiling rage came back tenfold. This woman who didn't even want to be in my life anymore was going to tell me that she knew what was best for me? Fuck her! How dare she think that she had the right to determine anything for me? I'd show her who was the one making the fucking decisions. Picking up the same pen I'd used to sign the papers, I lunged out of my chair and drove it deep into Courtney's right eye. Our combined weight toppled her own chair over onto the tile kitchen floor, and although she had opened her mouth to scream, the impact had forced the wind out of her lungs. Untangling myself, I had hurried over to a set of drawers and dug out a butcher knife. With the handle clenched tightly in my hand, I returned to Courtney. I'm not sure how long I stabbed her. I just kept plunging the knife into her body over and over again. Each time felt just as good as the first. By the time that I had grown too tired to continue, both myself and the kitchen were covered in blood, and Courtney was completely unrecognizable as she lay dead on the floor. Feeling a sense of calmness for the first time in a long time, I had washed up in the bathroom and changed into some of the clothes that I had left at the apartment. I had then gotten a small box out of the closet and filled it with items from around the apartment that I had purchased over the years. There was no sense in leaving them behind. It wasn't like she was going to need them anyway. Before I had left the apartment, the very last thing that I had done was go back over to Courtney's remains and look down at them. She had been such a strong woman in life, but now she was nothing at all. After what she had put me through, it seemed fitting. I had spit in the body and left. There was absolutely no way that she could have survived, none whatsoever. This had to be my mind playing tricks on me. It was the result of the panic I was feeling over the lights going out. That had to be it. I heard a quiet tinkling noise coming from a short distance in front of me. Courtney had a pair of acorn earrings that she liked to wear. When she moved, the dangling halves of the acorns would strike each other, making a distinct jingle-like sound. I tried to remember if she had been wearing them when I had killed her. I wasn't sure, but I thought that she was. Something moved in the darkness, and this time I could see it. I couldn't make out any details, but something even blacker than the shadows had shifted. My voice was caught in my throat. No matter how much I wanted to cry out and beg for this nightmarish creature to leave me alone, not a single word would come out. My entire body recoiled as something extended out of the darkness towards me. With the fear clouding my senses, I didn't recognize what it was, and I stared at it blankly. The object was shaken aggressively by the holder. Scared of what would happen if I didn't figure out what was going on, I peered closer at it. It was a piece of paper. It was too dark for me to tell for sure, but it didn't look like there was any writing on it. The only thing on it was a long, thin line that went from one side of the paper to the other. "One more to sign," a soft and raspy voice said from within the darkness. Another object was extended to me, and I took it immediately. I dropped it just as quickly. It was the pen that I had stabbed Courtney in the eye with. The unseen speaker hissed, and I quickly knelt down to collect the fallen pen. I had to grope around in the darkness for it, and for a horrible moment, I thought that I wouldn't be able to find it. My fingers finally wrapped around it, and I stood back up. "Sign," the voice instructed me firmly. Nodding rapidly, I turned slightly so that I could press the paper against the door. With a shaking hand, I signed my signature on the line. All of the lights in the stairwell burst to life. I screamed in surprise, dropping the paper and pen in the process. Before the scream had fully escaped my lungs, I felt something slam into me. I stumbled a short distance before tripping and falling to the hard concrete floor. It was the door that had hit me. It pushed inward, and a man in a police uniform stepped into the stairwell. He looked around before his eyes fell on me. He hurried over to me and helped me back to my feet. "Are you all right, sir?" the officer asked. "We got a call that someone was stuck in here." I couldn't answer him. Thinking back on it, I think I was in shock. The ordeal I had just gone through had taken everything out of me, and all that I could do was break down and start sobbing. "It's going to be okay," the officer told me awkwardly. "Sir?" another man's voice interjected. Through my tears, I looked towards the voice. A second officer had come into the stairwell. He was younger than the first, and he was staring at the older man with a look of surprise on his face. His right hand was raised up. Pinched between his fingers was a piece of paper, the same paper that I had dropped. Written in blood, slightly distorted from the wrinkles in the paper, and above my clearly visible signature were the words, "I killed my wife." "I told you there's a monster in there," a little girl said from out in the hallway.
As was usually the case during the winter, the rooms and hallways were absolutely freezing. Kathy Turner retrieved a sweater from the small closet in her office and quickly put it on. Making sure that her hair was still at least somewhat pulled back, she put on her lab coat and stuck her arms into her armpits in an attempt to warm them up. It didn't help that her office was the closest to the hospital's main entrance. Every time the doors opened, the cold air would blow right at her office door. Even if it was closed, the gusts would get in through the cracks and crevices and fill the spaces to drag the temperature down. She made a face. One of the many perks of being the newest doctor on staff. Another one would be having to work on New Year's Eve in the first place. All of the other doctors were bringing in 1974 with their loved ones, and she was stuck here. She sighed. There was no point in complaining, even just to herself. The building was quiet, and with the nurses handling most of the routine work, she was getting off easy, all things considered. She might even be able to finish the book she had been trying to get through for the past 3 months. Before she could sit down at her desk, she heard the sound of the front doors opening. Cold air washed in over her feet and legs from under the office door. She closed her eyes and shook her head. Lovely. "Dr. Turner," a man's voice called from out in the hallway. Kathy opened her eyes. It was the voice of one of the security guards. Whenever one of them came to get her, something was wrong. She mentally gathered herself and left the office. The guard was a giant of a man. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, and he was built like a linebacker. He nodded as she joined him. "The police are here," he told her as they headed towards the entryway. "Right," she replied shortly, knowing that meant she wasn't walking into a pleasant situation. A group of people were wrestling with a distraught man on a gurney near the front desk. He was tied to it with the usual straps, but a long cord had also been wrapped around his chest. His eyes were bulging and the veins in his neck were standing out. He was speaking so quickly that Kathy couldn't understand what he was saying. "Is that really necessary?" she asked as she approached, pointing at the cord. "You're damn right it is," a man dressed in a police uniform growled back at her. "Where are we putting this nut job?" "He's bleeding from his forehead," she pointed out. "He also has multiple contusions on his arms and legs. You should be taking him to County General." "We can't," one of the paramedics told her in a much kinder tone than the officer had used. "There's a major accident just outside of it. At least a dozen cars. No one can get in or out." "Besides," the officer put in, "a nut job belongs in the nut house." "We prefer to call this a hospital," Kathy snapped, already tired of the man's attitude. She looked over at the nurse behind the front desk. "Joanne, would you please show them the way to one of the rooms, one far enough away from the other patients that they won't be disturbed? 17 is open, I think." The paramedic stayed behind while the rest of the group followed the nurse. Kathy opened her mouth to say something, but he shook his head and waited until the others were out of earshot. When he was satisfied, he nodded. "There's one more wrinkle in this, Doc," he said, running a hand over his face. "I don't even know what this is," Kathy pointed out. "Everyone just barged in without actually filling me in. If I didn't think that man would be safer away from that cop, I wouldn't have assigned him a room in the first place. What is going on?" The paramedic hesitated. "Maybe it would be best if you get that from the officers." "Oh, yeah, they seemed really inclined to give an unbiased account." He smiled slightly. "You've got a point. The patient's name is Charles Mayweather. He lives over on 6th and Pennington. You know the neighborhood?" She nodded. "Yeah, pretty upscale place to live." "Maybe not tonight. From what we can tell, Mayweather just sort of snapped. He tried to kill his kid tonight." He looked away. 8 years old and his dad tried to strangle him. Jesus, why? "I don't know. You heard him ranting and raving, right? He's been doing that since we got on the scene. One of his neighbors called it in. Apparently the screaming was so loud they could hear it 2 houses over." Kathy mulled it over for a moment. "Could be stress. Maybe his family is prone to mental disorders. Any number of things could be possible." "Yeah, maybe." The paramedic turned his attention back to her. "He went completely off the deep end with those cops before we got there.
Even bit Officer Sunshine on the arm. But listen, Doc, there's that wrinkle I mentioned. We've got the kid with us. She blinked. You brought him here? Why the hell would you do that? We didn't have a choice. Child Services couldn't get there for hours because of the storm, and both us and the cops are going to be out most of the night with all the wrecks. Drunk people and ice don't mix. What are you going to do with him? Philip. His name is Philip Mayweather. Fine, whatever. Philip. What are you going to do with him? The paramedic smiled crookedly and shrugged. We were kind of hoping he could stay here until the social worker picks him up. Kathy shook her head. We're a hospital. No, you know what? Let's cut the crap. We're an asylum. This isn't a place for a kid. Neither is out there, he pointed out. We haven't been able to track down any family, and we've got to get back out there. He's got nowhere else to go. She sighed in frustration. As much as she didn't like to admit it, he was right. The child couldn't go back out into the storm with the police or paramedics, and at 8 years old, he certainly couldn't just wait alone in his house. She grudgingly nodded once. Okay, fine, she agreed. It's just a few hours, right? Yeah, that's right, the paramedic said with notable relief in his voice. Just until Child Services gets here. He's a good kid, too. Polite and everything. Yeah, you can stop the hard sell. Hand him off to Joanne when she gets back, okay? I have to go get Mr. Mayweather checked in. Kathy went over to the front desk and dug a clipboard out of one of the drawers. She was glad to find that admission paperwork was already fastened to it. With a final nod at the paramedic, she headed down the hall towards room 17. The second paramedic and the 2 police officers were just coming out of the room as she approached. They walked past her without a word. It was rather rude, but she actually preferred it that way. The officer she had briefly spoken to had rubbed her the wrong way, and she didn't have time for people like that. She childishly hoped that the bite on his arm was still hurting. She entered the room's open door without pausing. Although she was still in her first year at the hospital, she had seen her fair share of disturbed individuals. A surprisingly high number, in fact, when she took into account the town's small population. Joanne was in the room talking to the patient in soothing tones. Mayweather didn't seem to be responding to her. He just continued to rave at high speed while struggling against the bonds that kept him tight against the gurney. Mr. Mayweather, Kathy said to him, loud enough that she knew he could hear her voice over his own. My name is Dr. Turner. May I speak with you? He continued on as he had been. She motioned for Joanne to come closer, and she relayed that the son would be waiting for her in the entryway. The nurse nodded but didn't move as she continued to watch the man. I'll be fine, Kathy assured her. Just have one of the guards standing by in the hall, okay? Oh, and have one of the other nurses come in here to treat these wounds. Joanne left the room. She observed Mayweather for a few minutes. He was straining against his bond so hard that she started to worry that he would give himself a heart attack. Coming to a decision, she went over to the side of the gurney and gently placed her right hand on his shoulder. Mr. Mayweather, she said, keeping her voice calm and friendly, you need to settle down before you hurt yourself. I want to get this cord taken off of you, but I can't do that if you're pulling against it like this. The man turned his eyes towards her. They looked surprised, like he hadn't even realized that she was in the room with him. His ranting slowed down and grew quieter until they stopped entirely. He fell flat against the gurney and ceased struggling against the restraints. There, that's much better, she told him with a smile. Thank you for letting me help you. She set down the clipboard on the room's only chair and knelt down to get a better look at the cord. It was an extension cord, the kind that you could find at any hardware store. She shook her head in revulsion. No matter how difficult he had been, this was bordering on inhumane. It took her a few minutes to undo the knot. It had been tied tight, and the end had been looped through multiple times. She eventually managed to get it to come free and unwrap the cord from around his body. There, she said as she tossed it on the floor and retrieved the clipboard. That's much better, isn't it? I know the straps aren't very comfortable, but that should at least give you a bit more breathing room. Mayweather stared at her for a long moment. She returned his gaze as she waited to see what would happen next. She would eventually have to go through the standard admission forms, but she wanted to give him some time to process what was happening before getting into that. Truth be told, she was feeling a bit unsure of herself. The man that had been dragged into the room acting like a lunatic had been someone that she was used to. Not him in particular, but she had seen patients in the same kind of mental state before. Now, though, he was acting completely different. It was almost like he was another person entirely. The others, he half spoke, half whispered. The other straps? Kathy asked. Those can come off when I'm sure that you're not going to be a danger to either me or yourself. I'd like to talk for a while and see how that goes, and we can go from there. Is that fair? He nodded his head once. Okay, good. Let's start over. My name is Dr. Turner. Yours is? Mayweather, he replied after a moment. Charles Mayweather. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Mayweather. May I call you Charles? Yes. Good. Charles it is then. Now, are you on any medications that I should know about, or any... Philip, he interrupted sharply. Where is he? Kathy blinked. Philip? As in your son? He's safe. He's with one of the nurses right now. Mayweather's face grew pale. Keep him away. Keep him away. Why should we do that, Charles? Are you afraid that you'll hurt him again? He surprised her by laughing loudly. It was a cynical laugh, one that didn't have any mirth behind it. The sound was cut off as he began to cough. Kathy tried asking more questions, but Mayweather either refused to answer them or he was no longer processing that she was even speaking to him. Telling him that she would be right back, she left the room and made sure that the door closed behind her. Logically, she knew that he'd never be able to get out of the restraints, but something about the looks he had given her and the way his voice sounded made her want to take every precaution. She wasn't going to be able to get through to him when he was like this, and it was very possible that he would injure himself if he was allowed to remain in such a state. After motioning for the security guard in the hallway to stand near the room, she hurried down the hallway to the locked door at the far end. She fished a key out of her pocket and unlocked it. Inside was the hospital pharmacy. Normally, she would have opted for the less intrusive option of pills, but she doubted that she could get those down Mayweather's throat. Instead, she went over to a cabinet and retrieved a syringe and 2 small glass bottles. She put them into her lab coat pocket and hurried back to her patient's room. He was still caught up in a fit of laughter. I'm sorry about this, Charles, she said as she stuck the point of the needle into the first bottle and pulled back on the plunger part of the way before doing the same with the second bottle. Kathy inserted the syringe's needle into the man's arm and pushed down on the plunger. When she had emptied the syringe, she leaned back out of the room and tossed it and the empty bottles into a waste can in the hallway. She waited patiently for the medication to take effect. After a few minutes, Mayweather's laughing subsided and his body relaxed. She waited longer to make sure that it wasn't some sort of ruse. She doubted that he was in any condition to come up with anything like that, but there was no point in taking chances. There now, she said finally. Feeling better? I'm a bit lightheaded, Mayweather answered slowly. That's a side effect of the tranquilizer. Nothing to worry about. Now that you're calm, I have some questions that I need you to answer. Can you do that, Charles? Yeah, okay. Good. She paused to gather her thoughts. Can you tell me what happened tonight with your son? That thing is not my son, he spat back with such hatred that she was momentarily taken aback. How do you mean that? Who is he? He laughed again, but this time it only lasted for a few seconds. What's the point? You wouldn't believe me anyway. She arched an eyebrow. Try me. Mayweather was silent for a long moment. At first, Kathy thought that she had lost him again, but as she watched him closely, she could tell that he was internally struggling with something. He chewed on his lower lip as he stared up at the ceiling. "You're a psychiatrist, Dr. Turner?" he asked. "I am," she confirmed. "I figured by the room decor. It's funny, my wife used to joke that someday I'd be dragged kicking and screaming to the loony bin, and here I am." "You're married?" "I was. Doreen passed away 5 years ago. Wait, no, it's 6 now. As of this past November." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Not as sorry as I am." He sighed. "Anyway, as a psychiatrist, you must have some experience with recurring dreams." She nodded. "Some, yes. I've been having the same dream every night since the day my wife passed away. The exact same dream, down to the smallest detail." Kathy furrowed her brow. It was rare for someone to have a recurring dream that frequently. Usually a person would have them sporadically rather than over and over again. She sat down in the small, uncomfortable chair and crossed her legs. "What happens in this dream?" she asked. "I'm standing on a beach filled with white sand," Mayweather began. "In front of me is a vast ocean. It stretches from horizon to horizon. The water looks gray in the pale light, and its surface is completely undisturbed. It's flat and unmoving, without a single wave. I look out over the water for what feels like hours. Could be days, or weeks, or maybe even longer. I just wait on the beach for something to happen. I don't know what will, but I can feel it in my bones that something is going to happen." He licked his lips. One of the side effects of the tranquilizer was dry mouth. Kathy stood up and retrieved some water from the room sink in a small paper cup. She helped him take a few sips. "Thank you," he said gratefully. "After what seems like an eternity, I can just make out a figure walking on the surface of the water. At first I think it's some trick of the light, but as it draws closer I can see it's definitely a person. When it reaches the water's edge, I see that it's Doreen." "Your late wife?" she asks. "Yes. She's wearing this long, flowing white robe, and she looks like she did when she was in her 20s. She smiles at me, and all that I want to do is run to her. Somehow I know that I can't do that, though. I can't leave the beach." "Why is that?" "I don't know. I just can't. It's like there's this invisible barrier. I don't know how to explain it any better than that. I can't go into the water, and she can't come up onto the sand." "So there are rules in this dream." "I guess so." Mayweather grunted uncomfortably. "Can I at least have the strap around my head taken off? My neck is killing me." Kathy went over to the gurney and undid the restraint. He sighed in relief and moved his head from side to side. She could hear his neck crack as he did so. "Much better," he muttered before he began to describe his dream once more. "Doreen and I stared at each other for a long time. I don't know if you've ever lost someone that you love, someone that's your entire world, but you lose some of yourself when you do. Seeing her, even like this, makes me feel whole again. It's a feeling that you don't want to end." He stopped talking and stared off into the distance. His eyes were wet, and Kathy could tell that he was struggling to continue. She patiently waited until he started to speak. Eventually, Doreen reaches out one hand. I think that she's trying to touch me, but she's actually pointing. I turn around, and right behind me is a metal contraption. A machine. "A machine," she repeated. "What kind of machine?" In the dream, she calls it the Stygian machine. He sounded almost wistful as he spoke. An instrument that could pierce the veil between life and death. She tells me that if I can build it to the exact specifications, she and I can be together again. There was a scream from out in the hallway. Mayweather's head snapped towards the sound, and the blood rushed out of his face. His breathing became hurried and shallow. "What was that?" he asked sharply. "Just one of the other patients," Kathy assured him. "The nurses will get it taken care of. Tell me about this machine. What does it look like?" It's 3 pieces, he replied, his eyes still locked on the door. There are 2 platforms and a large ring. The ring sits on the platforms, and they supply power to allow it to spin. On all 3 pieces are these markings that I don't recognize. Describe them to me. I don't know. They look kind of like Egyptian hieroglyphics, but not quite. They're carved in the metal on nearly every square inch of the machine. If I unstrap your hand, can you draw some of them for me? Mayweather furrowed his eyebrows. Well, yes, but is it important? She tilted her head slightly. Could be. Symbols in our dreams can represent important messages that the subconscious is trying to pass on to the conscious. Being careful not to get in reach of his fingers, Kathy carefully undid the straps around his left wrist. He rotated it a few times, most likely to get the feeling back into it, but he didn't make any move to grab her. She carefully slid her pen into his hand and held up the clipboard so that he could draw on the paper. When he was finished, she retrieved the pen and looked carefully at the symbols. Tell me the rest of the dream, she instructed. There isn't much more to tell, Mayweather said. I look at the machine for a while, and then I wake up. But here's the thing. When I wake up, I know exactly how the Stygian machine should be built. I know exactly where every bolt should be and exactly how tight it should be tightened. I know that I can build it and get it working. Hang on a hunch, she stated. So you built it. His eyes narrowed as his head nodded ever so slightly. I built it. God help me. I built it. And you used it. Before he could reply, there was another yell from outside the room. This one only lasted for a second before it cut off in an odd gurgling noise. He opened his mouth, but Kathy was already continuing on. You built the Stygian machine and you used it, she said. Got the plans for it in your dream and, not knowing exactly what it did or what the symbols meant, you built it and flipped it on. Does that pretty much sum it up? It wasn't that simple, Mayweather countered with sudden anger. The machine took me years to build. Everything had to be exact. Every single night after my son went to bed, I'd go down to the basement and work on the blasted thing. I had to custom make most of the parts. It cost me nearly every penny that I had. And do you think that I liked killing those people? The words were barely out of his mouth when his eyes opened wide in shock. He stammered incoherently as he shook his head slowly. Why did I say that? He asked in a confused voice. Who did you kill? Kathy countered. Nobody, just some hitchhikers I picked up on the highway. The answer was automatic, and he didn't seem to have any control over it. Why did you kill them? I had to. The machine runs on human flesh and blood. Please stop. I can't. How many people did you kill? 11, maybe 12. I lost count. What did you do to me? Kathy set the clipboard down on the chair and reached out behind her head with one hand. Using 2 fingers, she took out the band holding her hair up, allowing it to fall down onto her shoulders. She brushed it away from her eyes before looking back at Mayweather. Sodium thiopental, she told him. I filled the syringe with medication from 2 bottles, remember? The first was a tranquilizer, like I said. The other was sodium thiopental. We use it mainly as a general anesthetic, but at the right dosage it can make a person very compliant when answering questions. You might have heard it referred to as truth serum. Mayweather stared at her uncomprehendingly. You built the Stygian machine, she continued. You carved the symbols into the metal. You fed it victim after victim to give it the strength to work. The whole time you thought it was just some contraption. Never once did you realize you had created something alive. Made of metal and oil, yes, but alive nonetheless. She leaned in close to him. And then a miracle happened, right? The machine actually worked. It shredded time and space to create a gate between this world and somewhere else. Only it wasn't your wife that came through. It was something else. Tears were streaming down Mayweather's face. He was on the verge of breaking down entirely. It was a bit surprising when he managed to choke out words around the sobs. It came through and... He sniffed loudly.
I thought Philip was in bed. He must have heard the noise from the machine, and he was at the bottom of the basement stairs watching, and the thing went into him. There was a hard thump against the door. It was quickly followed by a second, and then a third. When the fourth one came, thick red liquid sprayed against the small window that allowed hospital staff to look into the rooms from the hallway. It ran down the glass in wide streaks. Kathy shook her head in a mixture of annoyance and amusement. "I can't believe you're the one that did this," she said. "Then again, maybe I can. You're the perfect puppet, aren't you? An idiot that's easily manipulated. You didn't even think that much about what you were doing. You just followed an empty promise. You brought a god into this world without even realizing it. Then you, what, tried to kill it? As if you could." She absently smoothed a wrinkle out of her lab coat. "You asked me if I have any experience with recurring dreams, and I told you that I did. You see, Charles, I have one myself. There's a great darkness surrounding me, and a thunderous voice proclaims that I will be the first to greet the bringer of the world's end. When this voice speaks, you believe it. Now that day has finally come, and in a way that I could never have imagined." Kathy reached out and opened the door leading into the hallway. Standing just on the other side of it was an 8-year-old boy. He was wearing plaid pajamas. They were soaked in blood, and flecks of skin and gore were stuck to it and tangled throughout his light brown hair. In the hallway behind him, body parts were strewn around the floor, and blood was splattered across every surface. The boy took a step forward. There were small protrusions coming out from underneath his eyes, thin translucent tendrils that moved across the surface of his eyeballs. He opened his mouth, and 4 tentacle-like appendages emerged. Saliva dripped from them as they curled and writhed. "Charles Mayweather," Kathy said with a twisted grin on her face. "Please allow me to introduce you to the son of your blood, your labor, and your sin. He is ancient Era, Akkadian god of violence and plague, and the end of all things." The boy came into the room, and she slowly closed the door behind him. Mayweather screamed.
We made a mistake. A horrible, horrible mistake, and there's no putting this particular blood-soaked genie back in its bottle. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that there's no getting everything back out of that bottle. That's probably closer. We shoved the world into the bottle, and the genie is holding on to it for all it's worth. I'm not making any sense. This is just senseless rambling. That's a good thing, right? It's good that I still recognize that I'm not making sense. If I was all the way gone, I'd just think that everything coming out of my mouth is rational. Isn't that how insanity works? Come on, focus. Have to focus. There's no time for this. Get the message recorded so that others know what happened. Only have a few minutes. My name is Greg Roberts, and I'm a behavioral neuroscientist. For the past 6 months, I've been part of a government research project. No, not one of those kinds of projects. This isn't tied to the military or anything nefarious. At least I don't think that it is. Who really knows when you're working for the government on something classified, right? The team that I'm part of has been focused on using a combination of new therapies and evolving technology to help advance the field of mental health treatment. The more that we're able to connect with the patient, the more we can aid them. What the hell was that? I think... No, okay. Maybe not. I'm sorry. I don't remember what I was saying. Right, new treatments. The project has essentially been built around one man, Albert Weissman. He's absolutely brilliant. He's technically an engineer, but his areas of expertise stretch so far into every field that he can't really be defined by a single one. His mind puts all the rest of ours to shame. The step machine was his design. Wait, no, I haven't told you about the step yet. It's hard to keep things in order. My thoughts aren't in a straight line anymore. They're churning and writhing and changing order, and no matter how hard I try, I just can't get them to stop swapping places. STEP is an acronym, the letters S, T, and P. It stands for Subconscious Transmission and Projection. We call it the STEP because everything needs a fancy name when you're presenting it to people in charge that don't understand a neurotransmitter from a xylophone. The STEP, short enough for even the most limited of minds to remember. The machine itself doesn't look that remarkable. It's built into one of those reclining beds that you find in hospitals. There's a series of wires and cables that connect into two small discs that are attached to a person's temples on one side and a group of computers on the other. In turn, those computers are linked to a ring of projectors drilled into the ceiling of the room. While it doesn't look like much, what the STEP does is almost unbelievable. I've seen it work countless times and I still don't believe it. It feels more like sorcery than science. The STEP interprets all the chemical and electrical information flowing throughout the human brain and converts it into computer data. It then interprets that data to form images before sending those images to the projectors, which in turn produces three-dimensional videos of them. In short, the STEP lets us see the thoughts of the subject. Yeah, I know how that sounds. It sounds like pure science fiction crap. Whether you believe it or not, though, it exists. Keep in mind that 20 years ago, you would have been called a moron if you stated that you believed a portable phone would one day be more powerful than the most powerful computer systems of the time. Weissman is a genius, but he's also an idiot. This is his damn fault. How could he have been so wrong about what his own machine does? Wait, was he wrong? Is it possible that he actually knew what he was doing? Not an idiot. A madman. It's possible. Probable? I don't know. Can't think. My thoughts are too big, getting too tight in my mind. Makes it hard to think. The STEP tested so well on most people. We were able to do good work with it. It didn't just project the active thoughts. Just like its name implied, it could dig into the subconscious as well. It could show us thoughts that even the patient didn't know existed inside of them. The process of treatment was so accelerated that we could do the work of years in the space of weeks. Therapy sessions could be tailored to the individual so precisely that helping them through their various problems became laughably easy. I don't know when we put Ernest Carlyle into the STEP. It feels like it was earlier today, but I don't think that's right. Time doesn't matter here. Days and hours and minutes are all the same thing. This damn migraine. It feels like it's going to crush my brain. So much pressure. Like a broken boiler starting to swell and screech. Maybe you've heard of Carlyle. About a decade ago, he sent a series of bombs to daycares across the country. When he was finally identified and arrested by the FBI, he claimed that he had sent the bombs because children throughout the country had been replaced by demons summoned by the Illuminati. In medical terms, he was a certified lunatic. I don't know how Weissman got him, but he did. Carlyle was strapped into the STEP as he was monitored by half a dozen armed guards. Usually only a few of the project members were present each time the STEP was run. This time, we were all there. Each of us was fascinated by the idea of seeing into the mind of an insane man. At first, everything was fine. The STEP works in layers, you see. Conscious thoughts are the most prominent in the mind, so it would project those images first. The guards must have been surprised to see warped images of themselves in front of their faces. It was how Carlyle saw them, not how they truly were. There it is again. The screams within the screams. I thought locking myself in here would be enough to block them out, but I should have known better. These aren't voices that care about soundproofing and insulation. The screams are free of life's restrictions, free to flow into the ears of anyone they want. I think the worst part is the echo. It just bounces off the sides of your ears as it worms its way down the canals. They're worms made of voices that tunnel down, down, down into you. When the step reached Carlyle's deeper thoughts, that's when things went wrong. I can't describe the images the projector showed. Twisted pictures of creatures beyond words, demonic entities that never held a single shape for more than a second, with each iteration worse than the last. Carlyle kept laughing as the projections continued. At one point he cried out that now we all saw the truth, and that his words could no longer be suppressed by the weak-minded. Most of us could only stare in horror, but one of the scientists managed to snap out of it and shut down the step. When he did so, though, the projections continued. That wasn't possible. Without the step active, there was no power running to the projectors. That's when one of the demonic images reached over and tore the throat out of one of the guards. Weissman's machine had somehow given form to Carlyle's thoughts, or maybe it had drawn out things that were inside of him. That's what we all thought in that moment anyway. The demons started attacking the people closest to them, and the rest of us ran. What else could we do? We got the hell out of the step chamber and sealed the doors behind us. Somehow, the demons had appeared beyond the chamber, however. There were dozens of them lurking in the hallways, and the moment that they saw us, they attacked. Fellow scientists. No detachment through dissociation. Many of my closest friends were torn apart piece by piece by these nightmare creatures. In the confusion, I got separated, and I found myself here, in the security room. Like I said, I don't know how long I've been here. I've heard someone or something bang on the door a few times, begging for me to let them in. It could be fellow survivors. Probably not, though. It's more likely that it's the demons trying to trick me into opening the door. I'm no fool. I'm not opening that door. Oh, God, please stop this headache. It's pushing so hard against the inside of my skull. Maybe it's not a headache. What if it's the churning thoughts trying to push out of me? Those worm screams are driving them on, spurring them to grow and search and squeeze. The demons on the inside are more dangerous than those on the outside, you know. Their claws are sharper and their teeth gnash louder. Before I started recording this, I watched the security footage from the step chamber. For some reason, the footage doesn't show the demons. Instead, it shows everyone in the room watching the images before some of them start to kill each other and others run from the room. That's not what happened. I was there. These demons are sneaky. They've changed the footage so that anyone watching it later thinks everyone went insane from seeing the images projected from Carlyle's mind. I was there, though. It was demons. Sneaky, brutal, terrifying demons. The voices from outside the hall are trying to convince me otherwise. They're saying that our minds couldn't take what they were being shown and snapped. They say they believe it's only temporary, and that I need to open the door so that they can help. One of them even sounds like Shauna. I don't know how the demons know what my wife sounds like. The impersonator is talking about our children and how they need me and how I have to come out for their sakes. It even sounds like the speaker means it. Even with my thoughts squirming, though, I'm not going to fall for that. It's a hell of a try, pardon the pun, but these demons aren't going to fool me. I have to find a way out, though, and to do that I need to be able to concentrate. There's only one way to do that. I have to let out the worm scream thoughts. Then there will be space for thinking. There are a number of guns in a cabinet here in the security office. It's locked, but the lock is a pretty flimsy one. This is an old building, and you don't really need state-of-the-art security for the type of work that we do anyway. I bet that I can use this chair to bash off the lock to get to one of the guns. That will help me make a hole in my head for the worm scream thoughts to leave through. Then I'll be able to think straight again. Yeah, that's what I need to do. It's the smart thing. It's the sane thing.
When my mother was buried, I watched as every single shovel of dirt was tossed into her grave. Once the two groundskeepers had finished, I stepped onto the soft soil and spit on her headstone. I was glad that she was dead. The whole reason I attended her funeral was to see with my own eyes that she really was. I don't give a shit if that makes me sound like a bad son, or spiteful, or maybe simply petty. My mother deserves every ounce of venom that is in me. It's because of her that I grew up without a father. Unlike her, he was a good person, the kind that seems to be missing in today's world. In the spring, he would take me to see baseball games, and in the fall, it was football. He didn't do it out of any love of sports. He did it because he knew that I was obsessed with them in a way that only children can be, and he wanted to spend time with me while encouraging my interests. Nothing came before his family. His work, not his own desires, nothing. To this day, I've never met his equal. It's because of my mother that my twin sister is gone. If you're not a twin yourself, you understand this, not fully, but losing one is like having a part of yourself ripped away. It creates this hole that's never filled. More than that, though, she was incredible. Smarter than me, and more talented at most things. Although she surpassed me in so many ways, I was never jealous of her. It wasn't her and me. It was us. I lost the best part of me when she died. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I just need a moment. My mother had everything she could ever have wanted. Wealth, power, a husband that placed her on a pedestal above all others, and children that wanted nothing more than to please her. And yet she wanted more. More and more and more. Nothing else. My mother was a woman of excess. Having everything worldly, she instead turned her attention towards the otherworldly. I'm sure that doesn't come as a surprise to anyone here that there are items and objects that defy our limited understanding of science and the world around us. Some people call these things magical, and others call them haunted. Some even say that they're cursed. No matter what you believe them to be, we all know that they're out there. The greatest of these objects is the Fatu Machina. In Latin, it means the destiny machine. From the front, it just looks like an old human skull that is missing the jawbone. The bone is brown from age, and carved along the surface are hundreds of small symbols that join together to form a whole that looks like a map drawn by a madman. Legend has it that the skull belonged to Adam, the first of God's human creations, as well as the first man to have sinned. I have no idea if that's true or not. It's the back of the skull where things get strange. Instead of being solid bone, it's constructed of a highly intricate clockwork-like metal device. Tiny gears can be manipulated using a series of dials and levers, which in turn cause plates and rods to change positions. There are millions, if not billions, of possible combinations. I'm sure someone can work out the exact number, but it really doesn't matter. What matters is the Fatu Machina is a key that unlocks reality. It creates openings between places in our world and gateways leading to others. Imagine being able to stand up from your chair and simply take a step forward to be in the middle of Nepal. You could take an instantaneous trip to Bermuda, or if colder weather is more your preference, visit an outpost in Antarctica. How about stepping foot on a world countless light years away from the speck of dust we call Earth? Maybe journey to an alternate reality where up is down and down is up. If you could appear before whatever creator you believe in and speak to them, would you? That's what the Fatu Machina does. It presents you with endless possibilities. There's a catch, of course. It seems like there always is. To open a doorway, you have to find the right combination. You have to adjust the various dials and levers to the correct positions. Each door is a different combination. There's no way to know what combination unlocks what door except for trial and error. There aren't many stories about the Fatu Machina, and it's been a closely guarded secret by everyone that has possessed it. Everyone that has heard about the device knows one particular legend, though, and I suspect that the reason that you're here is because of that legend. Fatu Machina is supposed to be the only key in existence that can open the way to the Garden of Eden. If you're not caught up in your basic Sunday school, the Garden of Eden is, according to the Bible, the place where all life on earth began. It is home to many wonders, with two in particular standing out from the rest. Two trees grow in the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. Eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil bestows you with the collected wisdom of the world. You essentially gain the knowledge and understanding of everything that has, will, and can happen. It's as close to omniscience as a mortal being can come. The tree of life. Now that's the real prize, isn't it? One bite of its fruit grants you everlasting life. Not just immortality either. It gives you eternal youth at your absolute best. You're immune to poisons and toxins and every affliction. You will live a perfect, unending life until our universe is just a distant memory. If you ate from both trees, is there really a difference between what you would become and a god? It was the legend of the Tree of Life that drove my mother's obsession with the Fatu Machina. All of her wealth and possessions would be nothing if she just died like everybody else. She refused to believe that there was an obstacle that even she couldn't overcome. I'm not surprised that she managed to obtain it. When my mother wanted something, there was nothing that could stand in her way. She was a force of nature. I don't know exactly how she came to possess it, but I wouldn't put anything past her. I imagine there's at least one body buried in an unmarked grave somewhere due to her actions. From the moment her assistant put the black box containing the Fatu Machina in her hands, nothing else mattered to her. She locked herself in her study for days at a time as she tried combination after combination, carefully logging each attempt in a leather-bound journal. The only time that anyone saw her was when she emerged to eat or, on rare occasions, go to sleep for short periods of time. My father tried his best to coax her out of her obsession. I've never understood why. He really did love her. My sister and I said that we did, and I think there was some kind of connection there, but he actually felt that way about her. He was concerned for her well-being and did everything that he could to distract her from her work. Ultimately, his efforts were in vain. I don't know how many successful combinations my mother discovered during this time. The vast majority of combinations don't do anything. Only specific ones will unlock doorways. She might have failed to open any, or maybe did find some and simply didn't share them with us. For 5 months, she worked in solitude while the rest of us had no idea what she was doing. On a cold fall night in late October, however, there's no doubt that she successfully unlocked a doorway to another world. I had no way of knowing most of what I've told you up to this point when it actually happened. I was only 12, and I had never even heard of the Fatu Machina. I've learned most of this from reading her journals and through putting together pieces myself. All that I knew on that particular night was that I was suddenly sitting awake in my bed in the middle of the night in a pitch-black bedroom. My room had never been that dark before. There was always at least some light that managed to make it through my curtains during the night. Sometimes it wasn't very much, but there was still something. On this particular evening, though, I was surrounded by pure blackness. I'm not sure how long I sat there staring into nothingness before I noticed the voices. They were extremely faint, barely qualifying as whispers. There seemed to be dozens of them. I strained my ears in an attempt to figure out what they were saying. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out the words. Or maybe I could, and I just didn't understand what they meant. Even though I didn't comprehend the words themselves, somehow the messages they were conveying were clear. I'm not sure how to explain it. On some level, I just knew what the voices were telling me to do.
They put thoughts into my head that would never have come to me under normal circumstances. I felt a powerful urge to listen to those whispers and do as they instructed. What they were saying made so much sense. Life was hard, lonely, and full of disappointments. Trying to continue on with it was pointless. The only thing that made sense was to not play along with such a bad cosmic joke, to tie my bedsheet around my neck in the way the voices were directing me to, and put a stop to the endless cycle of pain and disappointment. I think that if I was any older, I would have done just that. At my age, though, some of the concepts the voices were communicating to me were things that I couldn't fully comprehend yet, and it was that confusion that kept me from totally accepting what I was being told to do. The whispers changed their tone as they became frustrated with my disobedience. The sound suddenly stopped, filling the darkness with silence. For the first time since I'd woken up, and probably for the first time in my entire life, I felt fear. Real, palpable fear. There was something in the room with me. I couldn't see it or hear it, but it was there. It was this kind of pressure that was coming from behind me. It loomed over me and gave off this sense of total malice. It was angry, and it was going to take that anger out on me. Without even realizing what I was doing, I jumped out of bed and blindly ran in the direction I thought my bedroom door was in. I was fully in the grip of panic, and that panic continued to rise as I kept running. I ran much further than I should have been able to in the small bedroom. Long after I should have reached a wall, I slammed hard into something solid. I finally got into the door. I twisted the knob and flung it open, hurrying into the hallway before closing it behind me. Before I even had a chance to turn away from the door, I noticed that the hallway was much colder than my bedroom had been. The change was a shock, and my skin immediately began to prickle. There was an odd burning sensation in my feet. I looked down and found that it wasn't being caused by something hot. Instead, I was standing in at least an inch of snow. I turned around and looked up towards the hallway ceiling. Thick white flakes of snow were falling from it. Forgetting my fear for a moment, I stared up at the indoor snowstorm in wonder. Eventually, I shivered as the cold snapped me out of it. I looked around the hallway. All of the lights were on. Instead of their normal warm white, they glowed a dim blue. The walls were covered in sheets of ice. Jutting out of the walls into the top were long, thick protrusions that tapered out to sharp points towards the middle of the hallway. They were nearly as white as the falling snow. My eyes fell on a section of wall near me. There was something behind the ice, something that unnerved me even though I couldn't immediately identify it. I stepped closer to get a better look. It was a growth that spread across the majority of the wood, a pinkish, flesh-like mass that resembled raw flesh. I looked back up at the protrusions. I was standing inside of a giant frozen ribcage. I hurried down the hallway with my arms wrapped around my chest in a futile attempt to stay warm. My bedroom was in a different section of the house than the others. When my sister and I had turned 8, we had been given a choice as to which unused bedrooms we wanted. We had chosen ones on opposite sides of the house, with hers being located near my parents' room. We had always been close, but we both agreed that we needed some space between us or we would drive each other crazy. The hall led into the entryway. This section of the house was in a completely different state than the frozen hallway. It was much warmer, and there was no snow or ice. The lights were also their usual color. There were, however, more bone growths. They weren't ribs, but were instead 4-foot-tall teeth. They were cracked in many places, and many were covered in brownish stains. They stuck out of both the floor and ceiling at random intervals. The floor itself felt soft as I slowly walked across it. It didn't look any different than it usually did, but the texture had a consistency of a firm yet wet sponge. Each step was disgusting. I started to get a bit queasy. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head towards the tall staircase leading up to the second floor. A scream welled up in me, the pressure of it so strong that I thought it would make my chest burst, but it remained trapped inside of me. At the top of the stairs, surrounded by the same pink growth that I had seen in the hallway, was a giant eye. It was so large that it took up the entirety of the second floor landing. Its iris was black, and Its blood-red veins stretched across its milky surface. It rolled around wildly as if it was in the throes of madness. I involuntarily took a step back. As I did so, the eye swung downward in its fleshy socket so that it was staring directly at me. Its gaze was so intense that it locked me in place. It felt so small, so weak as it examined me intently. Something began to drip from the eye's iris. First I thought it was some sort of fluid. When one of the drops pushed itself up off the floor on thin, spindly legs, however, I knew that wasn't the case. Small creatures were falling out from inside the eye. Each looked vaguely like a centipede with wispy, tentacle-like appendages extending from their black-shelled bodies. They swarmed down the stairs towards me. The eye spell was broken. I hurried towards the long corridor that contained my sister and parents' bedrooms. The creatures began to make chittering noises as they reached the bottom of the stairs and skittered after me. I made it into the hallway and struggled to close the heavy wooden door that separated it from the entryway. I barely managed to get it shut in time. The creatures continued to make odd sounds on the other side of the door. They made no attempt to break through. Everything that I'd been through collapsed in on me. I started to cry. I'm still a kid, after all. No kid is prepared to go through something so horrific. Oh, most adults aren't either. I slumped down to the floor and held myself as my sobs robbed me of my breath. It took some time, but I eventually got control of myself. I wiped the tears from my eyes and stood back up, feeling more exhausted than I ever had. I still needed to find my family. This hallway looked the same as it always did. I wondered if whatever had taken over the rest of the house hadn't reached here yet. Whatever the case, I was just glad that I was safe for the moment. My parents' room was the closest, so I hurried over to the door and opened it. There are two images that will always be burned into my memory. No matter how many years pass, I can always see them in perfect clarity. They'll be with me until I die. This was the first of those images. The bedroom was bleeding. Thick blood was running down the walls and pouring off the ceiling like crimson waterfalls. The floor of the room was submerged in it, and it washed through the open... The bedroom was bleeding. Thick blood was running down the walls and pouring off the ceiling like crimson waterfalls. The floor of the room was submerged in it, and it washed through the open door and out into the hallway as it covered my feet up to my ankles. In the center of the room, sitting on his knees with the blood flowing down around him, was my father. He was dressed in his pajamas and robe. His hands were stretched out to his sides with the palms upward like he was holding up two invisible objects. He was moaning, and his eyes were wide with fear. Standing behind him was a figure in a black robe. Its body was completely covered, and a ragged hood made it impossible to see its face. Paying no attention to me, the figure reached out its right arm. The robe slid away from the fingers slightly, and I saw that they weren't fingers at all, and were instead 3 delicate needles. Slowly, the needles pushed into and through the skin of my father's neck. My father gasped but remained still. The figure tugged the needles back, and a small sliver of skin peeled away from the neck while still remaining attached by a tiny flap. Using both hands, it pulled on the sliver over and over again. The skin began to unravel from my father's body. I don't know of a better way to put it. It came off like a pulled string unwinding a ball of yarn. My father didn't move, but the look in his eyes and the few sounds that escaped from his open mouth conveyed the immense pain that he was feeling. When roughly half the skin had been removed from his face, he finally saw me standing in the doorway. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Got the message, though. I could see it in his eyes just as much as I could read it on his lips. Go. I did it as I was told. Slammed the door shut and quickly backed away from it. I was a scared child. What could I have possibly done to save him? Logically, I know the answer to that is nothing. That thing that was killing him ever so slowly couldn't be stopped by a mere 12-year-old boy. That's the logical answer. Logic isn't much comfort on the nights that I lie awake in bed, remembering how I left him to die alone. Directly across the hallway was the door to my sister's bedroom. I stared at it without making a move towards it, my shirt and sweatpants soaked with water, sweat, and blood. I didn't want to go inside. Something bad was waiting for me in her bedroom. I was sure of it. It was something that I had been feeling since I left my own room but hadn't been able to focus on because of everything that had happened. I don't know if I believe the stories about twins having some sort of psychic connection. As one myself, I was never able to finish my sister's sentences or know what she was thinking. I didn't know when she was in distress or hurt when I wasn't around. Maybe some twins have that kind of connection. We didn't. What I do know is that there's a kind of bond that I've never had with another person. I didn't even realize that bond existed, not consciously, until that night. The only reason I noticed it then was because it was gone. My sister was dead. Couldn't explain how I knew that, but I did. I refused to believe what I knew, however. I felt this deep need to prove myself wrong, to show myself that she was alive and well. Putting aside all of my other feelings, I clung to that stubborn need to not accept the truth and marched over to her bedroom door. I hesitated for just a heartbeat before I opened it. I couldn't enter the room. A few feet inside of the door was a translucent red substance that filled the entire chamber from floor to ceiling. My first thought was that the room had been filled with some sort of liquid, but it didn't drain out through the now open door. It instead remained still. While it wasn't completely transparent, it was clear enough that I could see my sister suspended inside the substance. She was floating just above her bed, her arms and legs stretched out to the sides. Her eyes were open and staring off into nothingness. That is the second image that I will never forget. I couldn't look away. I tried, but my eyes remained locked on her. Even when her limbs began to slowly separate from her body and move off in opposite directions, I just kept watching. It wasn't until after the pieces had broken apart and completely dissolved that I closed the door and stepped away from it in a daze. There was one more door in this part of the house. It was at the far end of the hallway. I turned my head towards it. It led to my mother's study. I started to walk towards it. It wasn't a conscious decision that I made. I think I put one foot in front of the other out of a need to put some distance between me and the bedrooms. I didn't want to be anywhere near them, and it'd be some time before I was willing to really examine what I had lost. I had reached the halfway point when I heard a noise behind me. I turned and found that the door leading into the entryway had been opened. Stepping into the hallway was something that I couldn't comprehend. I need you to understand what I mean by that. When I say that I couldn't comprehend it, I'm not saying it was frightening or that I wasn't sure what I was looking at. I mean that it was impossible for my mind, or the human mind in general, to process and understand the being that was in front of me. It was large enough to fill the world, but at the same time small enough to interact with the tiniest of particles. It had both presence and the absence of existence. The entirety of the being was a contradiction that somehow created harmony. Out of everything that I'd seen that night or ever would in my life, this being terrified me the most. It was like I knew on some primal level that it existed my entire life. This was death, and I was nothing before it. It didn't make a move towards me. I couldn't even be sure that it was paying attention to me. Why would it? A single mortal life wasn't worth the attention of the end of all things. Not sure what else to do, I continued towards my mother's study. After every few steps I would look back over my shoulder, but the cosmic entity remained still. I reached the door and hurried inside. The study was large, one of the largest rooms in the house. Bookcases lined the walls, and display cases containing rare items were scattered throughout. In the center of the room was a wide oak desk. Sitting in a tall leather chair behind the desk was my mother. Her long hair was disheveled, and she looked older than I'd ever seen her. She didn't look up as I approached. Instead, her eyes remained locked on the object she was holding. Fatu Machina. It was operating. was a white glow coming from inside the skull's eye sockets. I could hear the whirring of gears inside of the machinery. I could feel a pulsating pressure emanating from it. My mother looked up at me and her eyes locked. It was in that moment that I understand that she had done this. It's her fault that my father and sister were dead. I also knew that, while she hadn't wanted them to die, she also didn't regret the decisions that she had made to bring us to this point. The manifestation of death entered the study behind me. I didn't turn around to look. I knew it wasn't there for me. It went around the desk and seemed to regard my mother closely. She hadn't moved an inch, and she didn't even flinch when it reached down and touched her on the forehead. She gasped, but otherwise didn't respond. It could have ended her right there. There would have been no effort needed to snuff out a single candle when it was used to extinguishing entire stars. It chose not to, however. It simply tapped her lightly on the head. With that done, it turned and flipped a lever on the Fatu Machina. The glow faded from the device's eyes, and the whirring of the machine stopped. The death manifestation disappeared, and the world inside of the house returned to normal. The night of horrors was over, and all that was left for me was a lifetime of unforgettable trauma. The bodies of my father and sister were never recovered. They disappeared along with everything else. They are still officially declared missing by the authorities. Most people believe that my father simply took my sister and left with her. Till recently, my mother had been living in a mental hospital. Death's touch hadn't killed her. Touch of such a being isn't meant to be experienced by a human. It drove her mad. She spent the remainder of her days ranting and raving in a private room, locked away from the rest of the world. It was a strangely fitting fate given that she caused everything because she searched for something to set her apart from everyone else. I haven't been able to forget what happened. God knows that I've tried. No matter how many bottles of alcohol I drink or syringes of questionable drugs I inject into myself, the memories remain. I lost everything that mattered in a single night in the worst way imaginable. There's nothing that can comfort someone when they witness something like that. A month ago, my mother died. It wasn't peaceful. The doctors told me that she choked on her own tongue during one of her fits. I can't pretend that I was upset about that. Everything in the world that she had and owned became mine. The house that's fallen into a state of disrepair, the various properties that she had purchased over the years, stacks of boxes filled with trinkets and heirlooms, everything. Those boxes include a small black one containing an old skull with a clockwork-like machinery attached to it. So, that's what you folks are bidding on this evening. Fatu Machina, the key to unlocking universes beyond imagination, and realms pulled straight from the depths of nightmares. Can't say for sure which you'll unlock. I can tell you with absolute certainty that, one way or another, it will change your life. Just be prepared for the possibility that something may come through to you, instead of you going to it. I also have a second item available for purchase to the person who wins this item. Sealed inside of this envelope is the exact configuration that my mother used the night she unknowingly sentenced my family to death. It is for sale to the auction winner for $5 million. I know that's a steep price. I also know what you're thinking to yourself right now. Given the staggeringly high number of possible configurations, it's almost impossible that you'll stumble across the same combination that my mother did. Why pay so much money when you can take such a microscopic risk instead? That's not the right question to be asking yourself, though. What you should be asking instead is what you would give to keep hell off your doorstep. Answer that question, and then we'll talk. Alright, let's get the auction started. I'm going to pass things back to Mr. Pembroke, your auctioneer this evening. Good luck to you all. And you can't say that I didn't warn you.
In a small town, nestled in an old, quiet neighborhood, there is a house. On the front lawn stands a white sign with metal stakes. The words painted on it announced to the few cars that passed by that the house will soon be for sale. Many of the properties in the neighborhood had the same kind of sign in their yards. The block was once filled with the sounds of children playing, the smells of outdoor cooking wafted through the air on warm summer evenings, and cheerfully twinkly Christmas lights illuminated the deep snow during the long winter nights. Now there is only the rustling of dead leaves and the whistling of the wind between the buildings. 3 stone steps lead up from the overgrown sidewalk. A rustling metal screen door is leaning up against them, its hinges broken in an empty space where the handle once was. When the police arrived, they hadn't been able to get it open, and they had been forced to tear it free from the door frame. The weeds growing in the flower beds have begun to claim it. They grow not only around it, but also through the small gaps in the screen. The house's front door is closed. The white paint is peeling from the wood, and the 2 rectangular windows are smeared with grime too thick to be seen through. Sections are splintered outward or otherwise warped. The door had withstood the battering it had taken from inside the house, but it hadn't escaped destruction without its share of scars. The realtor purchased the home for next to nothing at a bank auction last month. She hopes to be able to flip it for 4 or 5 times her investment. She's hired workers to perform repairs and updates next week, and the first thing they'll be doing is replacing the front door and removing the screen door entirely. Beyond the front door is the living room. It's dim inside even during the day, despite the blinds having been torn from the windows. The light that does manage to penetrate the gloom casts shadows across the floor and walls. The walls and ceilings have brown stains in many places. The stains resemble an abstract created by a manic painter. When they were fresh, they had been a combination of bright and dark red, but as the thick blood has seeped into the wood and dried, it has slowly turned brown. Next week, the blood will be covered with 2 coats of fresh paint. The paint will be a bright color, one that is inviting and pleasing to the eyes of the people that tour the house. Light blue, maybe, or perhaps something with a hint of green. The realtor hasn't decided yet. The carpet was originally light gray. It is now almost black from the dust and decay. Large areas are rotted. Multiple places are stained with the same color as the walls, and those sections of the carpet are hard and stiff instead of soft like it was when the family had lived there. One spot in the middle of the carpet is different from the rest. It has miraculously avoided most of the dust, and the original color can still be seen. This is most likely due to a slope in the floor or some trick of how the air flows through the room. Someone with a romantic streak and knowledge of how the bodies were found, however, would be quick to note that this is the same spot where the man and woman's fingertips have been touching from their final act of reaching out to one another. The carpet will be completely replaced next week. The new carpet will be very similar to the old, just clean and fresh. There won't be a single hint to prospective buyers that 2 people have died in the room. A doorway leads out into the kitchen. More of the stains can be found here, although they are fewer and farther apart than the ones in the living room. The dust-covered counter is missing large chunks along one side. A long crack runs down one section near where the oven used to stand. The hardwood flooring has a series of deep scores leading away from the counter and towards the glass doors overlooking the backyard. They had been gouged into the floor when the oven had been torn from its place and thrown across the room. 2 indentations mark where the appliance had come to a stop. Less noticeable is a small gouge in the flooring in the corner of the kitchen. It is barely an inch in width, but it goes nearly twice that far down into the wood. Bits of sharp metal from the tip of a carving knife are still embedded at the bottom of the gash. The realtor got a good deal on a new countertop and flooring at a local supply store. The store was going out of business due to the owner's retirement, and everything was heavily discounted. She had to pay retail for the oven, however, and she still isn't happy about that. Half a dozen carpeted steps lead down from the kitchen into the family room. The walls lining the stairs are covered in scratches. The over 200-pound man had tried to brace himself against them as the small girl had dragged him with one hand up the stairs, the fingers of her right hand digging deep into the flesh under his chin. It had been in vain. The only results of his attempt at stopping the inevitable had been the scratches on the wall and broken fingernails. Scratches on a wall are easily repaired, of course. A small amount of spackling paste applied with a putty knife, some time to let it dry, and some light sanding is all that it will take to get the wall ready for repainting. Half an hour's worth of work to hide all evidence of a man fighting for his life against the impossible strength of the girl. The room at the bottom of the stairs was originally a basement, but the family had turned it into a family room soon after moving into the house. The air smells musty and stale, and dust hangs in the air in the feeble light let in by the half window near the ceiling. The carpet is hard from absorbed moisture and crunches loudly when weight is put on it. The walls appear black from a distance, but they're actually a deep red. They are stained like the walls in the living room, but unlike those, they are completely covered. It is so thick and uniform that it looks like the blood was applied with a paint roller. They have absorbed so much of the ichor that they remain red rather than fade to brown. It was in this room that the house had wept blood. The thick liquid had run down from the ceiling and along the walls in wide streaks, coating and violating everything that it touched. The smell of iron still saturates the room. This room will be the most difficult for the workers to prepare. The blood has tainted the walls too completely to cover up. The workers will remove the existing drywall and install paneling instead. Paneling won't be as sturdy as the removed drywall, of course, but most of the potential buyers won't notice the difference, and it will save the realtor the additional cost. Once that is done, the workers will replace the trim along the bottom of the wall before stripping out the carpet and replacing it as well. The smell will be an issue. The scent of blood tends to linger. It will take several days of airing the room out to be rid of it. The door on the far side of the family room connects the inside of the house with the garage. 7 concrete steps flanked by a wooden hand railing lead upward to the ground floor. The garage is large, wide enough for 2 cars to be parked inside and still offers storage space. The realtor considers it to be one of the house's biggest selling points. The chain from the automatic garage door opener hangs down from the track. It is looped in the shape of a noose. The skin that had been stuck between a number of the links was removed by the police as evidence, but there are still a few individual hairs that were missed. The workers won't need to do much to get the garage ready. They'll reattach the chain to the opener, sweep up the scattered nails and broken glass, and make sure that the electrical box in the corner is up to code. At the end of each day they're on the job, they'll meet up in the garage to smoke and drink beers, and none of them will notice that a small section of the concrete floor to the right of the stairs is just a bit darker than the rest. In the living room is the final set of stairs in the house, the ones leading up to the second floor. These are the steps that the woman was thrown down as she begged the girl to stop. Her body was thrown so hard from the top that she missed the steps completely and landed with a sickening crack in the living room, so there's nothing that needs repaired. The upstairs hallway appears to be in good condition. Behind the walls and under the flooring, however, are countless cracks that hint at the structural damage it has suffered. As the woman backed away in horror towards the stairs, the hallway twisted and contorted as if it was a living thing trying to envelop her. The realtor doesn't know about this damage, but even if she did, she wouldn't want to spend the kind of money it would take to repair. There's a reason the house will be listed for sale, as is, when it is officially put on the market. There are 4 doors in the upstairs hallway. No matter how many times the realtor has opened them, they are once again closed when she leaves and comes back. She's sure that it's due to uneven flooring, and she's made it a point to pick up doorstops before the first scheduled open house. The room closest to the stairs on the right is the bathroom. The workers will need to treat it for mold, as there is some growing at the base of the bathtub and along the bottom of the sink. The seal around the toilet will also need to be replaced. Water had flowed from the sink, toilet, and bathtub. It had gushed out with great force, like a geyser bursting forth from the bathroom. The water had been dark and murky, filled with sewage and oil. It had splashed up onto every surface, and it had shorted out the electrical outlets just below the mirror. The realtor had needed to call in an electrician to fix the damage before she had been able to schedule the workers. The second door on the right side of the upstairs hallway leads to the missing boy's room. Although it's now very faint, a hint of the smell of rotten eggs still permeates the room. The realtor is hoping that it will be completely gone by the time the workers arrive, but if it isn't, she's going to have them scrub the room floor to ceiling. Nothing turns off potential buyers like a bad smell. Workers will need to clean at least the ceiling even if the scent has dissipated. Black markings resembling giant cigarette burns cover it. They form an intricate pattern of interwoven circles and triangles. There's something disconcerting about the designs. Looking at them too closely makes a person nauseous. Both the realtor and the police have experienced that firsthand. The workers will wash off the markings as best as they can before painting the ceiling. Once the paint has dried, they will apply stucco over top of it. That will help conceal the burn marks that remain. The master bedroom is through the first door on the left in the hallway. This is the strangest room in the house. The paint is missing from the top of the walls, but it covers the wall trim and the edges of the floor. It gives the impression that it had somehow slid down the wood, or perhaps melted right off of it. The realtor has no explanation for it. The pair of windows are permanently fogged over. Although at a first glance it looks like they're simply covered in filth, it's the glass itself that is too hazy to see through. The frames are warped to the point of not being able to be opened. Black handprints are visible in multiple places throughout the room. They are the hands of a child, small and thin with short fingers. Many of the handprints are smudged, but a few of them are so intact and perfect that all the lines and curves can easily be seen. Even the spirals of the fingerprints are exact and unblemished. The walls will be repainted. The windows will be replaced. The handprints will be scrubbed off. The wood will be swapped out as necessary. Nothing will be left to suggest that anything out of the ordinary had ever happened. The final hallway door opens into the girl's bedroom. Unlike all the other rooms in the house, there's nothing that can immediately be pointed to as being out of place or in need of covering up. It's the smallest of the bedrooms and it can feel a bit cramped, but otherwise it looks just like any other bedroom in any other house. Against one wall was where the girl's bed had once stood. She had loved to jump up and down on it even though her parents had told her 100 times not to. Next to that had been her little 2-drawer dresser. The unicorn lamp that had been placed on it was her favorite thing in the whole wide world. A pile of stuffed animals of all shapes and sizes had stood against the opposite wall. The largest of the toys had been a pink elephant that her father had won for her at the fall festival. Inside the closet had been her nice clothes. Her mother had referred to them as the girl's fancy clothes, the ones that she wore only on nice occasions. She had enjoyed the feeling of the soft dresses with the flower patterns, but her fancy shoes had pinched the sides of her feet, and she hadn't enjoyed walking in those. During the day, her mother had played tea party and dolls with her. Each evening, her father would tell her a story before kissing her on the head and tucking her in. Her brother hadn't come into her room often, but when he did, they would give the stuffed animals silly voices and take them on even sillier adventures. There had been happiness in this room. Laughter had bounced off of its walls. Smiles had been housed beneath its ceiling. Love had been shared. Just beneath the room's single window and nestled under a removable floorboard, inside of a metal box with a broken lock, is a book with a black cover. There are markings cut into the cover with a razor-sharp blade, markings that form shapes and objects that are both nonsensical and meaningful at the same time. Some of them are similar to the pattern of burn marks in the boy's room, but most of them are different, more complex. The material of the cover is torn in places. The pages are yellowed and crackle with age as they are turned. The book has been in the house for decades, and it was written much, much longer ago than that. It is a book that should never have been opened, especially by little fingers. In a small town, nestled in an old quiet neighborhood, there is a house. It is a house of madness, and a house of death. In 2 weeks, it will look like any other house, and it will be for sale.
I can't be the only one that feels like this is a very weird time. I'm sure there's a better term to go with than weird, but if there is, it's not coming to me. We've been locked down for over a year thanks to the pandemic. We've worn masks whenever we stepped more than a few steps outside of our homes, and all of our human interactions, the real kind that doesn't involve staring at computer screens, have come from an oh-so-intimate 6 feet away. This was our reality for so long that sometimes it feels like it was always going to be that way. Now that we're getting back to the way things were before the virus, or at least some reasonable facsimile of pre-pandemic life, it feels weird, right? The masks were annoying, sure, but don't you kind of miss them in a strange way? It's like a child being told that a nice soft safety blanket is no longer required and having it taken away. Dating is probably the most bizarre thing now. After sitting around in your home for a year eating nachos in your underwear and binging whatever cooking show happened to be streaming at the time, you're suddenly back out in the real world in places you thought you'd never be allowed to return to. To add to the awkwardness, you're sharing this experience with someone that you barely know. This was the position that I found myself in as I sat on a bench in front of an Italian restaurant waiting for my date to arrive. More than once I caught myself bouncing my leg up and down nervously. I had never been good on dates, even before the pandemic. And after more than a year, I wasn't just rusty. I was hopeless. A lot of what made me feel so inadequate was the conversation. No matter how hard you try otherwise, the discussion always seems to come back to the pandemic. How did you spend your time during it? Did anyone you know catch the virus? How strange does it feel being back out now? You know what follows that line of conversation? Silence. Very awkward silence. It's tough to recover after going down that path. I was so wrapped up in my thoughts that I barely registered my date's arrival. We had never met in person before, having just communicated through text and the dating app we both used. On the app she had gone by the name Lost Love, but outside of the digital world, her name was Jenna Borden. She was a good deal shorter than I was, with the top of her dark hair coming up to the height of my shoulders. I felt like I was looming over her when I stood up to greet her. Her eyes were bright blue with flecks of purple throughout, a rather exotic look that I had never seen before. They peered up at me over the black face mask she was wearing. There's another thing that's much more awkward now than it used to be. We're so programmed now to avoid human contact that greeting one another normally is nearly a foreign concept. Not knowing what else to do, I raised my hand in a rather stupid wave. She returned the gesture, looking just as unsure about what to do as I was. I don't know what to do, Jenna admitted in a pleasant yet nervous voice. I feel like I've just come out of a coma and I'm trying to figure out complicated calculus equations. I laughed. With 2 simple sentences, she had broken the ice. Do you do that often? I asked. Emerge from comas with the express purpose of doing math? Oh, all the time. I've done it 3 times today already. I hope you don't mind the mask. I'm still a little paranoid, you know? I shook my head. I completely understand. I've been fully vaccinated for almost 2 months now, and I still carry one in my pocket just in case. Is this restaurant okay? We can go somewhere else if you want, somewhere with outdoor dining. No, it's fine. I actually love this place. Why don't we go inside and find a table? It turned out that I had been worried about nothing. Jenna was easy to talk to, and she seemed just as interested in avoiding certain subjects as I was. Our personalities were similar enough for us to enjoy each other's company without being so close that we agreed on everything. I've always found that to be important, as it's boring to be around someone that doesn't have something new and different to contribute to the conversation. She didn't remove her mask during the course of the meal. At first I thought she was just going to wear it until the food arrived. That was the common practice that many people followed, so that would have made sense. When we got our drinks, however, she slid the straw up under the bottom of the mask and drank it that way. When she finished with the sip, she slipped the straw back out and placed the glass onto the table. I didn't find that as strange as I once might have. She had already told me that she was still worried about the virus after all. If anything, it made me feel more self-conscious about not wearing my own mask. She kept on her face when the meal itself was served, and that struck me as odd. Most people would have at least pushed up the bottom of the mask to expose their mouths so that they could eat. Instead, she used one hand to pull the mask forward a bit, making just enough separation between it and her face to allow her fork access. It seemed like a cumbersome way to eat. I didn't say anything about it to her, of course. First of all, it wasn't any of my business. And secondly, I didn't want to make her feel as if I was judging her. It had been a while since I enjoyed a first date to this degree. I didn't want to say or do anything to jeopardize it, especially over something like this. We ended up foregoing dessert. Although she didn't say anything about it, I could tell that she was starting to get a bit uncomfortable being in such an enclosed space. I paid the check despite her protest that she wanted to split it. I very much believe in equality, but there are certain things that were ingrained in me as a child by my father, and being the one to pay on a date is one of those things. I followed it up by applying another one of those lessons and opening the door for her as we went back outside. "So," Jenna said as we stood on the sidewalk, "what now?" "I honestly hadn't thought that far ahead," I replied sheepishly. "We're just a couple of blocks away from Pleasance Park. We could go for a walk there." "Going for a casual stroll on a first date? How very old school of you. I think that's a fantastic idea." We chatted as we slowly walked through the small downtown Broken Bend area. As we did so, I kept finding myself glancing down at her. There was a definite attraction. I couldn't quite tell if she was feeling the same thing, but I thought that she might be. This was going much better than I could have hoped. As we reached the first intersection before coming to the park gates, Jenna sneezed. I turned towards her just in time to see an odd movement under her mask. It was like it had briefly pulled tighter against something, or that something had pushed against it from underneath. The movement was gone before I could even fully register what I had seen. I quickly shrugged it off. It had just been some trick of the light, or the soft breeze that was blowing through the streets had made it wrinkle and my eyes had misinterpreted things. We crossed the street and entered Pleasance Park. At the front was a playground filled with kids running around like maniacs while their exasperated parents attempted to maintain some semblance of order. I smiled to myself. "Do you like kids?" Jenna asked, noticing my expression. "I do," I answered. "You?" She nodded. "Yeah, well, I like them to a point." "I'm not sure that I follow." "For the most part, I love being around them. Playtime, meals, all of that. I love that stuff. I start to become less enthralled with them when it's time for a temper tantrum or a diaper change." I laughed. "I can't argue with that." "You know what I like more than children?" "What's that?" "Going down a slide." She pointed, and there just so happens to be an open one right over there. I watched as she hurried over to the tall slide and started to climb up the steps. The pure joy she exuded was endearing. It was also something that I could understand and relate to. It wasn't just a slide. It was a symbolic return to a simpler time. I squinted slightly as I chided myself for sounding like a first-year college student that had just had his first intro to poetry class. For a brief moment I considered going up the stairs after her. It had been at least a decade since I had been on a slide, and the urge to go down one again was strong. I was quite a bit larger than I had been back then, however, and a quick look was all that it took for me to see that I wasn't going to fit on it. Instead, I walked around to the far side to meet her at the bottom. As Jenna came down the slide towards me, I noticed the movement under her mask again. This time it wasn't just a small section of her covered face. Odd ripples and waves ran across the entire area. Her feet touched the ground, and as she began to stand up, I saw that there were 4 bumps, each triangular with the longest points near the mouth. They were moving in and out like they were pulsing. By the time she was fully standing upright, the lumps were gone, and the face mask had returned to normal. She looked up at me with an odd expression. "Everything okay?" she asked. I couldn't explain away what I had seen this time. There was no doubt in my mind that I had definitely seen something. Something that wasn't natural. I glanced over at the children playing. There really was something wrong with Jenna. Something dangerous. I couldn't let on that I knew that she wasn't what she appeared to be. Not here, anyway. I couldn't put the kids and their families at risk. I mustered up the best smile that I could. Yeah, absolutely, I replied. I'm just a bit sad that I'm too big to take a trip down the slide myself. Oh, I don't know, she said with a tilt of her head. You look like you're the perfect size to me. She started walking towards one of the nearby trail markers. Pleasance Park was home to about a dozen hiking trails, each of which traveled through a different section of the dense woods. Not many people used them during this time of day. They were secluded, and the perfect place to go when you wanted privacy. I almost didn't follow her. My first instinct was to bolt back towards downtown, but I looked back over at the playing children again. I couldn't do anything that might put them in harm's way. Reluctantly, I went after her, and we entered the tree line. Jenna reached out and took my hand. I smiled over at her, but all I could think about was how firm her grip was. It was like a vice, as if she was making sure that I couldn't get away. This is okay, right? She asked. What? I said dully as I was pulled out of my thoughts. Me holding your hand. This is okay, right? Yeah, it's fine. Sure? Yeah, I'm sure. She was testing me. Or maybe she wasn't. Instead, she was luring me in. She must have realized that I was no longer at ease. Now that I knew something was wrong, I began to notice small things I hadn't before. She kept sneaking looks at me as we walked, her eyes carefully inspecting me before turning back towards the trail. Her walk was also just slightly odd. Her steps were light and didn't make as much noise as they should on the leaves and twigs. Did you enjoy your lunch? She asked, her eyes returning to my face. It was good, I said. How about yours? Oh, not bad. I do prefer my meat a bit more raw than they prepared it, though. It looked pretty red to me. What can I say? She replied with a laugh. I like my meat bloody. Jenna turned her attention forward once again, and I noticed more movement under the mask. The firm triangular objects pressed tightly against the cloth for a few seconds before retracting back towards her face. My mind flashed to images I had seen of insect mandibles opening and closing. I felt panic rising in me. I forced it down. Obviously, I was in a dangerous situation, but the only way that I was going to get through it was if I kept my wits about me. We came to a narrow section of the trail. The brush was thick enough on both sides that it only allowed for us to walk through one at a time. I gave her a smile and motioned for her to go first. It was, after all, the gentlemanly thing to do. She released my hand and started through. I let her get a few feet ahead of me before taking the knife out of my pocket. Slowly unfolding the blade from the handle, I followed her down the trail, expecting her to turn and attack me at any moment. This would be the perfect time. We were all alone, and because of the dense brush, I wouldn't be able to easily escape. Somehow I knew that I was out of time, and she was about to strike. It was now or never. Gritting my teeth, I lunged and wrapped my arm around her shoulders. Before she could even cry out in surprise, the knife was cutting across her throat. I shoved her forward so that the blood wouldn't get on me. She stumbled a few steps before collapsing face first to the ground. Being careful not to touch the growing pool of blood on the dirt floor, I rolled her over just in time to hear the final gurgling sounds coming out of her severed larynx and see the light fade out of her purple-flecked eyes. I ignored all of that and grabbed the mask with my right hand. I ripped it off and stood back up. Jenna's face was completely normal. With the exception of a small scar on her bottom lip, the skin was unblemished, and there was no sign of any sort of abnormality. It certainly wasn't the face of a monster. I sighed as I licked the blood off the knife. There was no point in beating myself up over it. It was an easy error to make. I had made it several times over the past year, and I'd probably do it again at some point. Honest mistakes happen. I grabbed the body by the feet and started pulling it off to the side of the trail. It's best to get rid of it before some hiker came across it. Who knew how someone would react to seeing a dead body in the woods? The pandemic made some people act a little crazy, after all.